When one-armed rancher Caleb Mercer opened his gate on that bitter Texas morning in 1879, he never expected to find redemption kneeling in the frost. The starving woman clutching a shivering child wore a scarf he'd seen before, wrapped around his dying brother in arms on a blood-soaked battlefield. She was the widow of the man who saved his life, the man he'd failed to save from the hangman's noose. Now she was begging for food, and he was drowning in guilt. One decision would either bury his past forever or force him to face the debt he could never repay. Welcome to this story of second chances and redemption on the frozen frontier. Stay with me until the end to see how love can rise from the ashes of war and injustice. Comment below with your city so I can see how far this tale travels across the world. The wind across the Texas Panhandle in January of 1879 didn't just blow, it cut. It sliced through wool and leather and found the bones beneath, settling there like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. Caleb Mercer stood in the doorway of his failing barn, his right sleeve pinned and empty, his left hand gripping a hammer he'd been using to patch a stall gate that should have been replaced 2 winters ago. Everything on this ranch should have been replaced 2 winters ago, including himself. The cattle were down to 11 head, the fences sagged like old men's spines, and the house behind him leaked cold through every crack in the timber. At 34, Caleb felt twice that age. The war had taken his arm. Peace had taken everything else. His purpose, his energy, his ability to look himself in the mirror without seeing a man who'd failed at the one thing that mattered most. He was about to turn back into the barn when he saw her, a figure at the gate, 100 yards down the frozen road. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, the way winter sun could make fence posts look like men and tumbleweeds look like children. But then she moved, sinking to her knees in the dirt, and he saw she was real. A woman, thin as a knife blade, clutching something to her chest. Even from this distance, Caleb could see the desperation in the way she held herself, the way her body curved protectively around whatever she carried. He set down the hammer and started walking. His boots crunched through the frost-brittle grass. The wind pushed against him like it was trying to turn him back, but Caleb Mercer had learned to push through things that hurt. It was the only skill he'd mastered since coming home. As he got closer, details emerged. The woman's dress had been nice once, dark blue calico with tiny flowers, but now it hung on her frame like it belonged to someone else, someone better fed. Her black hair had come loose from its pins and whipped around her face in tangled strands. And pressed against her chest, wrapped in a blanket that had more holes than fabric, was a child. A little girl, maybe 4 years old, with huge dark eyes that watched Caleb approach with the wariness of someone who'd learned early that the world was not a gentle place. The woman looked up when his shadow fell across her. Her face was all sharp angles, hunger and exhaustion carved into every line. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from the cold. But it was her eyes that stopped him. Dark brown, proud even in desperation, refusing to look away even as she knelt in the dirt of his ranch. "Please," she said, and her voice cracked on the word. She had an accent, soft and rolling, the Spanish inflection turning the English syllables into something almost musical despite the desperation behind them. "Please, senor, I can work. I can clean your barn, mend your fences, anything. Just one plate of food. For my daughter, she hasn't eaten in 2 days." Caleb opened his mouth to respond, but the words died in his throat, because the wind chose that moment to gust hard enough to tear at the woman's shawl, and he saw what was wrapped around her neck beneath it. A scarf. Faded red cotton, hand-stitched with desert flowers and yellow thread. He knew that scarf. He'd watched it being made, sitting around a campfire in Missouri while the rain hammered the tent above them and Mateo Cruz's needle flashed in the firelight. Mateo had laughed at Caleb's suggestion that sewing was women's work, had said his mother taught him that a man who couldn't mend his own clothes was a man who'd freeze to death for pride. The flowers were desert marigolds, Mateo had explained, because they grew in the harshest places and bloomed anyway. And wasn't that what soldiers had to do? Bloom anyway? Caleb had seen that scarf one more time after Missouri. On a blood-soaked battlefield in Arkansas, where Mateo had wrapped it around Caleb's shattered arm, tied it tight to slow the bleeding, and dragged him 3 miles to the field hospital while artillery screamed overhead. The last time Caleb had seen Mateo Cruz alive, he'd been riding away with that scarf around his own neck, waving once before disappearing into the smoke of a war that was eating them all. "Where did you get that scarf?" The words came out harder than Caleb intended, almost an accusation. The woman's hand flew to her throat, fingers clutching the faded fabric. Fear flashed across her face, quickly replaced by defiance. "It belonged to my husband, Mateo Cruz. He's dead now." The name hit Caleb like a fist to the chest. He'd known, of course he'd known, but hearing it spoken aloud, hearing this starving woman on her knees confirm what he'd read in a 2-line notice in a Colorado newspaper 8 months ago, it made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Mateo Cruz, age 31, executed for desertion and smuggling. No mention of the families he'd helped, the children he'd fed, the fact that he'd earned a battlefield commendation for saving Caleb's worthless life. "Stand up," Caleb said quietly. "Please, don't kneel." The woman stood slowly, swaying slightly, one hand still clutching the child to her chest. The little girl whimpered, and the sound cut through Caleb like broken glass. He looked at her properly for the first time and felt his heart stop. Those eyes, dark and warm and shaped exactly like Mateo's, right down to the way the left one tilted slightly at the outer corner. Mateo's daughter. This was Mateo's daughter, and she was starving, and he'd been sitting in his broken-down ranch feeling sorry for himself while his dead friend's family froze and starved somewhere in the world. "What's your name?" Caleb asked, though he already knew. Mateo had written it in the letter, the one that had arrived 3 weeks before the execution notice, smuggled out of a Colorado jail by a sympathetic guard. "Isabella," the woman said. "Isabella Cruz. This is Rosa." She shifted the child slightly, and Rosa buried her face in her mother's neck, too weak or too frightened to even be curious about the strange one-armed man standing before them. Caleb thought of that letter, still tucked in the bottom of his trunk in the bedroom. Mateo's handwriting, always so careful and precise despite hands that could have belonged to a farmer or a fighter. "Brother, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. They're going to hang me for crimes I didn't commit, and there's nothing to be done about it now. But I need you to make me a promise. My wife, Isabella, she's strong, but she's alone, and she'll have no one when I'm dead. If she ever finds her way to you, if she ever needs help, please, take care of her. Take care of Rosa. I saved your life once. Now save theirs. That's all I ask." Caleb had read that letter 20 times, memorized every word, and then tucked it away because what could he do? He didn't know where Isabella was, didn't know how to find her. He'd told himself that was enough, that the intention mattered. But here she was. And intention meant nothing in the face of a starving child who looked exactly like the man who'd died screaming Caleb's name while he lay bleeding in an Arkansas field hospital. "Come inside," Caleb said. Isabella's eyes widened. "Señor, I can work first." "Inside. Now. Before that child freezes to death in your arms." He turned and started walking toward the house without waiting to see if she followed. Behind him, he heard the crunch of her footsteps, hesitant at first, then faster, as if she was afraid he might change his mind. Caleb pushed open the door to his house and held it, gesturing for her to go ahead. She slipped past him, Rosa still pressed to her chest, and stopped in the middle of the main room, looking around like she wasn't sure if this was real or some kind of cruel dream. The house wasn't much. One main room with a stone fireplace, a bedroom off to one side, and a kitchen area that consisted of a cast-iron stove, a table, and a few shelves. But it was warm, or at least warmer than outside, and there was wood stacked by the fireplace and a pot of beans that had been simmering since morning. "Sit," Caleb said, pointing to the table. "I'll get food." Isabella sank into one of the chairs like her legs had simply given up. She arranged Rosa on her lap, smoothing the child's tangled hair with shaking hands. Rosa's eyes followed Caleb as he moved to the stove, wary and huge in her thin face. He could count her ribs through the threadbare dress she wore. Caleb ladled beans into 2 bowls, cut thick slices of the bread he'd baked yesterday, and poured milk from the jug in the cold box. His movements were efficient, practiced. He'd learned to do everything one-handed, learned to wedge pots against his body and cut with a knife while holding the bread with his hook, the curved metal tool he'd had made to replace the hand that was rotting in an Arkansas grave. It wasn't pretty, and it sure as hell wasn't the same as having 2 hands, but it worked. He set the food on the table in front of Isabella and Rosa. The little girl lunged for the bread before her mother could stop her, cramming it into her mouth so fast she nearly choked. Isabella caught her hands, tears streaming down her face. "Slowly, mija," she whispered. "Slowly, or you'll be sick." But even as she cautioned her daughter, her own hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the spoon. Caleb turned away, staring at the fire, giving them what privacy he could while they ate, like people who'd forgotten what it felt like to be full. The sound of spoons scraping bowls, of Rosa's small gasps between bites, of Isabella's quiet weeping, it filled the house in a way it hadn't been filled in years. When the scraping sounds finally stopped, Caleb turned back. Both bowls were empty, licked clean. Rosa had curled up in her mother's lap, her eyes already drifting closed, her small body finally relaxing into something like safety. Isabella held her daughter with one arm and wiped her eyes with the other, trying to compose herself. "Thank you," she said, and her voice broke on both words. "Thank you. I can work now. You can rest," Caleb interrupted. "The bedroom is through that door. There's blankets on the bed. Take the child and sleep. We'll talk about work later." Isabella looked at him with something close to disbelief. "Senor, I don't understand. You don't know us. Why would you—" "I knew your husband." The words came out flat, hard. "Mateo Cruz saved my life in the war. He wrote to me before he died. Told me to take care of you if you ever needed it. So that's what I'm doing. Now take your daughter to bed before she falls asleep at this table." Something shifted in Isabella's face. The wariness didn't leave, but it was joined by something else. Recognition, maybe. Or the beginning of understanding. She stood slowly, cradling Rosa against her chest, and moved toward the bedroom door. Then she stopped and turned back. "He talked about you," she said softly. "In his letters from the war. He said you were the only officer who never treated him like he was less than human because his skin was brown. He said you were a good man." Caleb looked away. He was wrong. A good man would have saved him from that noose. A good man would have tried. Did you try? The question hung in the air between them. Caleb thought of the letters he'd written to the Colorado governor, to the military tribunal, to anyone who might listen. He thought of the weeks he'd spent riding to Colorado, arriving 3 days after the execution, standing at Mateo's unmarked grave with nothing to offer but rage and grief and the knowledge that he'd been too slow, too late, too useless. Just like he'd been too slow in that Arkansas field, too broken to fight beside the man who'd saved his life. "I tried," he said finally. "It wasn't enough." Isabella nodded slowly. Nothing was enough. Not for men like him. Not in this world. She adjusted Rosa in her arms and moved to the bedroom door. "But you're letting us in. That's something. That's more than anyone else has done." She disappeared into the bedroom, and Caleb heard the creak of the bed, the soft murmur of Spanish as Isabella settled her daughter under the blankets. He stood in the main room, staring at the empty bowls on the table, at the crumbs of bread, at the evidence of hunger that had been, briefly, satisfied. Then he walked to his trunk, lifted the lid, and pulled out Mateo's letter. The paper was soft from handling, the ink slightly faded. He read it again, even though he knew every word by heart. At the bottom, below the signature, Mateo had added one more line in smaller writing, as if he'd been afraid to make it too prominent. "I don't blame you for anything, brother. You gave me friendship when everyone else gave me spit." That was enough. That was everything. Caleb folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the trunk. Then he went outside to finish fixing the barn gate, because sitting still meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. And remembering meant seeing Mateo's face as they dragged him to the gallows, screaming that he was innocent, that he'd only been helping families cross the river to safety, that the smuggling charges were lies manufactured by men who wanted him silenced. The hammer felt heavy in his left hand. Everything felt heavy. But he swung it anyway, driving nails into wood, fixing what could be fixed, because that was all a one-armed man with a chest full of guilt could do. Fix what he could, when he could, and hope it was enough. Inside the house, Isabella lay in a real bed for the first time in 6 weeks, her daughter warm and safe beside her, and cried silent tears into a pillow that smelled like wood smoke and loneliness. She thought of Mateo, of his laugh, of the way he'd kissed her goodbye that last morning and promised he'd be back by supper. She thought of the weeks after his death, of being driven from their small home by neighbors who'd decided a deserter's widow was no better than a deserter herself. She thought of Rosa's face growing thinner, of the way her daughter had stopped asking when Papa was coming home, of the desperate calculation that had brought them here, to the last address in Mateo's letters, the last place she could think to go. She hadn't expected mercy. She'd expected to be turned away, or worse, to find the man Mateo had described already dead himself, because good men seemed to die young in this world, and cruel ones lived forever. But Caleb Mercer had opened his door. He'd fed her child. He'd given them his bed. And when he'd said Mateo's name, she'd heard something in his voice that sounded like the same grief that lived in her chest, like maybe she wasn't alone in remembering that her husband had been good and kind and worth more than the 2-line death notice that was all the world had given him. In the barn, Caleb hammered nails and thought of Mateo Cruz teaching him Spanish curse words during long marches, laughing until his sides hurt when Caleb mispronounced them so badly he'd accidentally called the captain a blessed donkey instead of a stubborn one. He thought of Mateo's hands wrapping that scarf around his ruined arm, of the blood soaking through the fabric, of Mateo's voice saying over and over, "Stay with me, brother. Stay with me. You don't die here. You don't die on my watch." The gate was fixed. Caleb stood back examining his work. It would hold for another winter, maybe 2. Not perfect, but good enough. He gathered his tools and headed back to the house as the sun started its slide toward the horizon, painting the frozen prairie in shades of gold and pink that would have been beautiful if everything wasn't so goddamn cold. When he stepped inside, the house was silent, except for the crackle of the fire. He moved quietly to the bedroom door and looked in. Isabella and Rosa were curled together under the blankets, both deeply asleep. Rosa's small hand was fisted in her mother's dress. Isabella's arm was wrapped protectively around her daughter. Even in sleep, neither of them looked entirely peaceful. They looked like people who'd learned that safety was temporary and sleep was vulnerable, and letting your guard down meant waking up to fresh horrors. Caleb closed the door softly and went to bank the fire. He'd sleep in the chair tonight, give them the bed. It was the least he could do. It was nothing compared to what he owed. But it was a start, and maybe, if he kept starting, kept fixing what he could fix, kept showing up when Mateo's family needed him, he could begin to chip away at the mountain of debt that sat on his chest every time he closed his eyes. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, 3 people who'd all lost pieces of themselves in a war that was over, but refused to die, found themselves under the same roof, bound together by blood debt and desperation, and the ghost of a good man who'd deserved so much better than the world had given him. It wasn't peace, but it was shelter. And for tonight, that would have to be enough. Days became a rhythm. Caleb woke before dawn, stoked the fire, put coffee on to boil. Isabella emerged from the bedroom with Rosa still sleepy-eyed and clinging to her skirts. They didn't talk much at first. Isabella was too wary, too used to kindness that came with prices attached. Caleb was too buried in his own head, too uncertain how to navigate the strange situation of having a dead friend's widow and child in his house. But work was a language they both understood. Isabella insisted on earning her keep, and Caleb couldn't bring himself to refuse her. She started with the barn, mucking out stalls that hadn't been properly cleaned in months, organizing tools, mending the tears in the old canvas he used to cover hay bales. Rosa followed her mother everywhere, a small shadow with enormous eyes, watching Caleb with the careful attention of a child who'd learned to read adult moods for signs of danger. Caleb chopped wood, repaired fence posts, tended his small herd of cattle. At night, he cooked simple meals, beans and cornbread, fried potatoes, occasionally a chicken from the coop behind the house. Isabella watched him work one-handed with the focused efficiency of someone who'd learned to adapt or die, and slowly her expression shifted from wariness to something like respect. "You're better with one hand than most men are with 2, she said one evening, watching him gut a rabbit he'd snared. He was holding it against the table with his hook while his left hand wielded the knife, the movements quick and precise. Caleb shrugged. "Had to learn. World doesn't stop turning just because you lost a limb." "No," Isabella agreed quietly. "It doesn't stop for anything, does it?" There was weight behind those words, and Caleb looked up from the rabbit to find her staring at Mateo's scarf, which she wore every day wrapped around her neck or tucked into her dress. He wanted to ask her about it, about Mateo, about everything that had happened after the man he'd called brother had ridden away from that field hospital with blood on his hands and hope in his eyes. But the questions felt too big, too sharp, so he went back to gutting the rabbit and said nothing. Rosa was the one who broke through first. It happened on the 5th day when Caleb was sitting on the front step trying to fix a bridle that had snapped at the bit. Rosa had been watching him from inside the doorway, as she always did, maintaining the careful distance her mother had taught her to keep from strange men. But curiosity must have finally outweighed caution, because she edged out onto the step and sat down a few feet away, her too big dress pooling around her thin legs. Caleb glanced at her but didn't speak, didn't want to spook her. He just kept working, threading the leather strap through the metal ring with his left hand while his hook held the bridle steady against his knee. "Does it hurt?" Rosa asked suddenly, her voice small and clear as a bell. Caleb looked up. Rosa was staring at his right arm, at the pinned sleeve and the hook extending from it. Her expression wasn't frightened or disgusted, just curious, the way children could be curious about things adults had learned to look away from. "No," Caleb said. "Not anymore. It hurt bad when it first happened, but that was a long time ago." "What happened to it?" "A cannonball exploded near me, sent metal flying everywhere. A piece went through my arm. The doctors had to take it off so I wouldn't get sick and die." Rosa considered this, her small face serious. "Mama says my papa saved a man who got hurt in the war. Was that you?" Caleb's hands stilled. He looked at this child, 4 years old, maybe 5, thin as a rail and solemn as a judge, and felt something crack open in his chest. "Yes," he said, "that was me. Your papa carried me 3 miles to the hospital. I wouldn't be here if he hadn't done that." "Mama says papa is dead now." "I know. I'm sorry." Rosa nodded, accepting this the way children accepted all the terrible truths adults handed them. "Mama cries at night. She tries to be quiet, but I can hear her." She looked up at Caleb with those eyes that were so much like Mateo's it hurt to meet them. "Are you going to make her cry too?" The question hit him like a bullet. Caleb set down the bridle and turned to face Rosa fully. "No," he said, and he meant it with every broken piece of himself. "I'm not going to make her cry. I'm going to help you and your mama. I promise." "People break promises," Rosa said matter-of-factly. "They promised Papa wouldn't die, but he did anyway." Caleb didn't have an answer for that. She was right. People broke promises. The world broke promises. He'd made promises to Mateo. "I'll visit when the war's done. We'll drink together. I'll meet your wife and daughter." And every single one of them had shattered when Mateo had been dragged to a gallows for crimes he didn't commit. But he reached out his left hand anyway, held it open between them, an offering. "I can't promise the world won't hurt you again," he said quietly, "but I can promise I'll try my best not to be one of the things that does. That good enough?" Rosa stared at his hand for a long moment. Then she reached out her own small hand and placed it in his palm. Her fingers were cold and thin as bird bones. Caleb closed his hand gently around them, and something in his chest that had been frozen since Arkansas began, slowly, to thaw. Inside the house, Isabella stood at the window and watched this exchange, tears streaming down her face. She'd been so afraid that coming here was a mistake, that this stranger who'd known her husband would turn them away or worse, that she'd walked Rosa into danger trying to escape it. But this man, this broken, guilt-ridden man who cooked with one hand and fixed fences alone and looked at her daughter like she mattered, he was trying. She could see him trying, the effort of it written in every line of his face. That night, after Rosa was asleep, Isabella sat at the table while Caleb washed the dinner dishes. She'd offered to do it, but he'd waved her off, said she'd done enough that day. She watched him work, efficient, even one-handed, and finally spoke the question that had been building in her chest. "Why did you really let us in? Don't say it's just because of Mateo." Caleb stilled, his back to her. Water dripped from the plate in his hand. "What other reason would there be?" "Guilt, pity, Christian charity, the need to feel like a good person. Any of those could have brought us through your door. But you didn't just feed us and send us away. You're letting us stay. You gave us your bed. You're teaching Rosa letters and letting her follow you around, even though I can see it hurts you to look at her because she has his eyes." Isabella's voice was steady, despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "So I'm asking you straight. What do you want from us? Because nothing in this world is free, and I need to know what price you're going to ask." Caleb set down the plate and turned to face her. His expression was difficult to read in the firelight, shadows playing across the angles of his face. He looked older than his years, worn down by things that had nothing to do with physical age. "I don't want anything from you," he said finally. "Except maybe absolution. I couldn't save Matteo. I tried, but I was too slow, too late, too useless. Just like I was too slow in that field when he was dragging my broken body to safety. He spent his whole life saving people, and when he needed saving, I wasn't there." Caleb's voice cracked. "I wasn't there. So if I can help you, if I can keep his daughter fed and warm and safe, maybe that counts for something. Maybe that means his death wasn't for nothing. Maybe that means I'm not completely worthless." The silence that followed was heavy. Isabella stared at him, at this man who'd been carrying a mountain of guilt for a friend he couldn't save, and felt something shift in her understanding. She'd thought she was alone in her grief, but Caleb Mercer was drowning in his own, and it was the same shape as hers, Matteo-shaped, Matteo-sized, a hole in the world where a good man should have been. "He didn't blame you," Isabella said softly. "In his last letter to me, before the end, he wrote about you. He said if you ever knew what happened, you'd probably try to carry the weight of it, and I should tell you that was foolish. He said you gave him something worth more than rescue. You gave him dignity when everyone else gave him spit. He said that was enough." Caleb turned away sharply, his shoulders shaking. Isabella stood and moved closer, stopping a few feet away, giving him space but letting him know she was there. "You can't save dead men," she said, "but you can honor them. You can help the people they loved. You can look his daughter in the eye and teach her that not all men are cruel. That's what you're doing. That's what matters." "It's not enough," Caleb said hoarsely. "It's all there is." They stood in the kitchen, two broken people bound together by the ghost of someone better than either of them, and for the first time since Matteo's death, neither of them felt entirely alone in their grief. The days continued, and the ice between them began to thaw. Isabella told stories of Matteo, how they'd met at a church festival, how he'd courted her with flowers he'd picked from the roadside because he was too poor for store-bought, how he'd held Rosa the day she was born and cried like his heart was too full to hold it all. Caleb shared his own memories, Matteo's terrible jokes, his skill with a rifle, the way he'd always shared his rations even when there wasn't enough to go around, the letters he'd written home that painted the war as an adventure because he didn't want Isabella to worry. Rosa bloomed under the attention and the steady meals. The hollow look left her eyes. She started smiling, then laughing, a sound like bells that filled the house in a way it had never been filled. She followed Caleb everywhere, chattering questions about the ranch, about the animals, about everything under the sun. He answered patiently, teaching her the names of the cattle, showing her how to collect eggs without startling the chickens, letting her help him measure grain for the horses. One afternoon, Caleb pulled out an old slate board and a piece of chalk. He sat at the kitchen table with Rosa perched on a chair beside him, her small legs swinging. "You want to learn to write your name?" he asked. Rosa's eyes went wide. "Yes. Mama knows letters, but she never had time to teach me." Caleb smiled, a real smile, the first Isabella had seen on his face. "Well, we've got time now. Let's start with the first letter. This is I." He drew the letter carefully on the slate, his left hand shaking slightly from the unfamiliar task. "For Isabella. That's your mama's name." Rosa leaned forward, fascinated. "Show me more." They spent an hour working through the letters, Rosa's small hand gripping the chalk while Caleb guided her, correcting the shape of the S, showing her how to connect the letters. When they finally spelled out Isabella, Rosa shrieked with delight and ran to show her mother, who was mending a torn shirt by the fire. "Mama, look! I wrote your name. Mr. Caleb showed me." Isabella took the slate with shaking hands, staring at the wobbly letters her daughter had formed. She looked up at Caleb, who was standing awkwardly in the kitchen doorway and mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." He nodded and turned away, busying himself with the coffee pot. But Isabella saw the way his shoulders relaxed, the way some of the tension bled out of his frame. He was finding purpose in teaching Rosa, in helping them, in being useful again. And she was finding something too, not just safety, but hope. The hope that maybe they could build something here, something that honored Mateo's memory instead of just mourning his loss. That night, Caleb did something he hadn't done in years. He went to his trunk and pulled out an old coat. Mateo's coat, the one he'd been wearing when he'd dragged Caleb to the hospital, the one Caleb had kept because he couldn't bring himself to bury it with the rest of his war memories. It was too big for Rosa, far too big, but Caleb had learned to sew during the war, crude stitches that held but weren't pretty. He could fix this. He worked by lamplight, cutting down the coat, taking in the sides, shortening the sleeves. His left hand moved steadily, the needle flashing. It took him 3 nights, working after Isabella and Rosa had gone to bed, but finally it was done. A coat, child-sized, made from the fabric that had once kept Mateo warm. Not perfect, but good enough to keep his daughter safe through the winter. When he gave it to Rosa, she put it on immediately and spun in a circle, the hem flaring out around her knees. "It fits! Mama, look! It fits!" Isabella recognized the fabric. She recognized the stitching pattern on the cuffs, the way the buttons were set. Her eyes met Caleb's across the room, and the gratitude there was so intense it hurt to witness. She didn't say anything, didn't need to. They both knew what that coat meant, that Mateo was still here, still protecting his daughter, still loved and remembered and honored. The winter deepened. The wind howled. The cattle huddled together for warmth. But inside the small house on the frozen prairie, 3 people who'd all lost everything began slowly and carefully to build something new from the broken pieces of what they'd been. February arrived with the false promise of warmth, 2 days of sunshine that melted the top layer of frost before the cold returned with renewed vengeance. Caleb was in the barn repairing a saddle when Isabella found him, her face flushed from the wind, her hands twisted in her apron. "I need to go into town," she said without preamble. "We're out of flour and salt, and Rosa needs shoes. The ones she has are held together with thread and hope." Caleb looked up from the leather he'd been working. Town meant people, and people meant questions, and questions meant explanations he wasn't sure either of them was ready to give. A one-armed rancher living alone was unremarkable. A one-armed rancher suddenly housing a Mexican widow, and her child would set tongues wagging from here to the county line. "I can go," he offered. "Give me a list and I'll—" "No." Isabella's voice was firm. "I need to do this myself. I need to walk into that town and hold my head up and show Rosa that we don't hide. We don't cower. We exist in the world, and we have every right to be here." She paused, then added more softly, "But I need you to come with me, not to protect me. Just to be there. Please." Caleb studied her face, saw the determination there and the fear underneath it. He thought of Mateo standing up to a captain who'd been working men to death, refusing to back down even when it meant extra duty and reduced rations. That same steel lived in Isabella's spine, even if the world had tried its damnedest to beat it out of her. "All right," he said. "We'll go tomorrow. All 3 of us." The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold. They took the wagon, Caleb driving with his left hand while his hook rested on his knee, Isabella beside him wrapped in every shawl she owned, Rosa bundled between them in Mateo's cut-down coat. The 6-mile journey to town felt longer in the silence, each of them preparing for whatever reception awaited. The town of Redemption, named by optimistic founders who'd clearly never lived through a Texas winter, consisted of one main street lined with weathered buildings that looked like they'd been beaten into submission by the wind. A general store, a saloon, a church, a land office, and the combination courthouse and jail that served as the seat of what passed for justice in this part of the Panhandle. Maybe 40 families called this place home, scratching livings from ranching or farming or servicing those who did. Caleb pulled the wagon up in front of the general store. Several men loitering outside stopped their conversation to stare. Caleb recognized most of them. Pierce Dalton, who ran the grain warehouse, Tom Chen, whose family owned the laundry, old Samuel Wright, who'd lost both sons in the war, and spent his days whittling on the porch of the saloon. Their eyes tracked the wagon, lingered on Isabella, sharpened with curiosity. "Stay close," Caleb murmured as he helped Isabella down. Rosa clung to her mother's skirts, suddenly shy in the face of so many watching eyes. Inside, the store smelled of tobacco and coffee and the particular mustiness of dry goods that had been sitting too long. Martha Hendricks stood behind the counter, a woman whose face had been set in permanent disapproval sometime around 1860 and hadn't softened since. Her eyes went wide when she saw Isabella. "Caleb Mercer," she said slowly. "Didn't expect to see you in town, and with company." "Mrs. Hendricks," Caleb nodded politely. "We need supplies, flour, salt, sugar if you have it, and shoes for the girl." Martha's gaze raked over Isabella with the thoroughness of a woman cataloging ammunition for future gossip. "I see. And who might this be?" Before Caleb could answer, Isabella stepped forward. She met Martha's stare without flinching, her chin high despite the threadbare dress and worn shawl. "I am Isabella Cruz. This is my daughter, Rosa. We are staying with Mr. Mercer while we recover from traveling." "Traveling?" Martha repeated the word like it tasted suspicious. "From where?" "Colorado." The word came out clipped. "My husband died there. We had nowhere else to go." Something flickered in Martha's expression. Not sympathy exactly, but a slight softening around the edges. A widow was a widow, after all, even a Mexican one. "I'm sorry for your loss. War. Execution." Isabella's voice didn't waver. "For crimes he didn't commit, but they hanged him anyway, because men like my husband don't get justice. They get rope." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Martha's lips pressed into a thin line, and Caleb tensed, ready to grab their supplies and leave if this went sideways. But then Martha reached under the counter and pulled out a pair of small leather shoes, hardly worn. "My granddaughter outgrew these," she said gruffly. "They'd probably fit your girl. No charge." Isabella stared at the shoes, then at Martha, clearly unsure whether this was kindness or some kind of trick. "I can pay, I said no charge." Martha set the shoes on the counter with a decisive thump. World's hard enough on children without making them walk on frozen ground in shoes held together with thread. She cut her eyes to Caleb. "You're doing a decent thing, Mercer, taking them in. Your mama would be proud." Caleb felt something loosen in his chest. His mother had died when he was 15 before the war, before everything went to hell, but she'd raised him to believe that turning away someone in need was the surest way to rot your own soul. "Thank you, Mrs. Hendricks." They gathered their supplies: flour, salt, sugar, coffee, a small sack of peppermint sticks that Martha insisted on throwing in for the child, and loaded them into the wagon. Rosa wore her new shoes, walking in careful circles to feel how they fit, her face lit up with a joy so pure it hurt to witness. Isabella watched her daughter with tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. They were loading the last sack when a voice cut across the cold air. "Well, well, Caleb Mercer. Didn't know you'd taken up collecting strays." Caleb's back stiffened. He knew that voice, smooth as oil and twice as slippery. He turned slowly to face Hollis Kane, the man who owned half the county and wanted the other half, whose word carried more weight than the law in most matters, because he'd appointed himself magistrate and nobody'd had the spine to challenge him. Kane sat astride a black gelding that probably cost more than Caleb's entire ranch. He was a big man, running to fat and middle age, but still carrying the ghost of the fighter he'd been in his youth. His coat was expensive wool, his hat beaver felt, his boots polished to a shine that seemed obscene in a town where most people wore leather held together with wire and prayer. "Kane," Caleb kept his voice neutral, "didn't know you made a habit of commenting on other men's business. When that business involves bringing undesirables into our community, it becomes everyone's business." Kane's eyes slid to Isabella, and there was something in his gaze that made Caleb's blood run cold. Not desire exactly, but ownership. The look of a man who believed everything he saw existed for his taking. "This your woman, Mercer?" "This is Mrs. Cruz. She and her daughter are staying at my ranch." "Cruz?" Kane rolled the name around in his mouth like he was tasting it. "Mexican?" "American," Isabella said sharply, her accent thickening with anger. "Born in San Antonio. My husband fought for the Union in your war. What did you fight for, senor? Or did you stay home and get rich while better men died?" The air went tight as a bowstring. Several people on the street stopped to watch, sensing confrontation. Kane's face flushed dark red, and his hand moved toward the rifle on his saddle. Caleb stepped between them, his body blocking Isabella from Kane's line of sight. "We're done here," Caleb said quietly. "Mrs. Cruz, Rosa, get in the wagon." "Not quite done." Kane's voice had gone cold. "I'm curious about something, Mercer. This woman's husband, what was his name again?" Isabella's face went white. Caleb felt his stomach drop because he saw where this was going, saw the trap opening like a mouthful of teeth. But Isabella lifted her chin and said clearly, "Mateo Cruz, he was executed in Colorado last year." "Mateo Cruz?" Kane smiled, and it was the smile of a snake that had just spotted a mouse. "I thought that name sounded familiar. Wasn't he that deserter, that smuggler who got himself hanged for running illegals across the border?" "He wasn't a smuggler," Isabella said, her voice shaking with rage. "He was helping poor families find safety. He was feeding children. He was doing what the government wouldn't. He was a criminal." Kane cut her off. "And you're a criminal's widow. Makes a man wonder what other criminal elements you might bring to our peaceful town." He turned his gaze to Caleb. "You sure you want that kind of trouble on your land, Mercer? People might start asking questions about what else you're hiding out there. The only trouble I see is a man who's got nothing better to do than harass a widow and orphan." Caleb kept his voice level, despite the fury building in his chest. "Now, if you're done making yourself feel important, we've got a long ride home." He turned and helped Isabella into the wagon, lifted Rosa up beside her. The little girl was crying quietly, her face buried in her mother's skirts. Caleb climbed up and took the reins, every instinct screaming at him to turn around and put his fist through Kane's self-satisfied face. But he was one-armed and outmatched, and starting a fight in the middle of town would only make things worse for Isabella and Rosa. "This isn't over, Mercer," Kane called after them. "You bring that kind of filth into our community, you'll answer for it." Caleb didn't respond. He just clicked to the horses and guided the wagon out of town, feeling Kane's eyes on his back like a target. Behind him, Isabella sat rigid as carved wood, one arm around Rosa, the other hand clutching Mateo's scarf at her throat. They were 3 miles out of town before Isabella finally spoke. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have provoked him. I should have kept my mouth shut." "No." Caleb's voice was hard. "You shouldn't have to keep your mouth shut. That man's a bully and a bastard, and Mateo would be proud of you for standing up to him. Mateo's dead because he stood up to men like that." Isabella's voice cracked. "Dead because he believed people deserved better, and powerful men couldn't let that stand. I can't watch it happen again. If Kane comes after you because of me, then he comes after me. I've survived worse than Hollis Kane." "You don't understand." Isabella twisted in her seat to face him, her eyes desperate. "That man, Hollis Kane. I know that name. Mateo mentioned it in one of his letters from jail. He said there was a magistrate, a powerful man who'd signed the order to execute him, even though there was no evidence, no trial, just accusations from people who wanted him silenced. He never said the name, but he said the man owned half of Colorado and wanted the other half. The description, it matches." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. "Are you telling me Hollis Kane had something to do with Mateo's execution?" "I don't know, maybe. Kane's a common enough name, and Mateo never gave me details because he didn't want me trying to fight it. But the timing—" She broke off, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter. What matters is men like that don't forget insults. They don't forgive disrespect. And I just made us all targets." Rosa whimpered, and Isabella gathered her daughter closer, pressing her face to the child's hair. Caleb stared at the road ahead, his mind working through possibilities and coming up empty of good ones. If Kane really had been involved in Mateo's death, if he was the kind of man who'd execute someone on false charges just to silence a voice he didn't like, then Isabella was right to be afraid. And if Kane decided Caleb was a problem, there wasn't much one-armed rancher could do to stop him. But he'd made a promise. To Mateo, to himself, to Rosa, when she'd placed her small hand in his. He wasn't going to break it just because some powerful bastard thought he owned the world. "We'll be careful," he said finally. "We'll keep our heads down, avoid town when we can. But I'm not sending you away, you hear me? You and Rosa stay. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. Isabella looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Reassurance maybe, or certainty, or just the confirmation that he meant what he said. Finally, she nodded and turned back to face the road, holding her daughter close as the wagon rattled over the frozen ground. That night, after Rosa had fallen asleep, Caleb and Isabella sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the wind howled its familiar song. "Tell me about Mateo's trial," Caleb said quietly. "Everything you remember." Isabella stared into her coffee cup. "There wasn't a trial." "Not really. They arrested him in Denver, said he'd been smuggling people across state lines for money. They had witnesses, people Mateo had helped, who suddenly claimed they'd paid him for passage. But it was all lies. Mateo never took money. He barely had enough to feed us. But these witnesses, they stood up in that courtroom and swore he'd taken gold, that he was running a criminal enterprise. Did you see them? The witnesses?" "One of them. A man named Vicente Reyes. Mateo had helped his family cross from Texas into Colorado 6 months before the arrest. Vicente wouldn't look at me when he testified, just kept his eyes on the floor and said what they'd told him to say. Someone got to him, threatened him, or paid him, or both. I'm sure of it, but there was no proving it. No one would talk to me. I was just the criminal's wife, and people either pitied me or spat at me, but nobody helped." Isabella's voice was bitter. "The magistrate. They never said his name in court, just his honor. He barely listened to Mateo's defense, just banged his gavel and said the evidence was clear and the sentence was death. 3 weeks from arrest to execution, 3 weeks to destroy a good man's life." Caleb thought of the letter Mateo had written, the desperation in every line. Did Mateo ever mention who he thought was behind it, besides the magistrate? He said there were men who didn't like that he was helping families settle on land they claimed, said there were ranchers who wanted the territory empty so they could expand without interference. But he never named names. I think he was trying to protect me. If I knew too much, I'd become a target too. Isabella laughed, a sound with no humor in it. As if that mattered. They came for me anyway. After the execution, people drove me out of our home. Said a deserter's widow didn't deserve shelter. Rosa and I lived in the street for 2 weeks before I sold everything we had left and used the money to get us out of Colorado. And you came here. I came here because it was the only address I had. The last place Mateo mentioned in his letters from the war. I didn't know if you'd even still be alive, but I had to try. I couldn't let Rosa starve in the street because I was too proud to ask for help. She looked at Caleb, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You opened your door. You fed us. You gave us your bed. Why? Don't say it's just debt. Don't tell me it's only guilt, because I need to know if we're safe here, or if this is just another place we'll have to run from. Caleb set down his coffee cup carefully. He thought about all the easy lies he could tell, the comfortable explanations that would let him hide behind duty and obligation. But Isabella deserved better than lies. So did Rosa. So did Mateo's ghost, watching from wherever dead soldiers went. When I lost this arm, he said, staring at the pinned sleeve, I thought my life was over. Thought I was useless, worthless, better off dead. I came back here to my family's ranch and just existed, going through the motions, waiting to die, really, because what was the point of living when I couldn't do anything that mattered? He paused, then looked at Isabella. You and Rosa, you gave me a point. You gave me something to do that matters, someone to protect, someone to care for. I'm not saying I'm good at it. Hell, I'm probably terrible at it. But for the first time since the war, I feel like I have a reason to get up in the morning. So yeah, it started as debt, started as guilt, but it's not that anymore. You're not charity, you're family, and I protect family. The silence that followed was heavy with things neither of them quite knew how to say. Finally, Isabella reached across the table and placed her hand over Caleb's. Her palm was rough from work, her fingers cold from the perpetual chill of the house. Mateo chose well when he called you brother, she said softly. He would be glad you're here for Rosa, for me. I should have been there for him. You're here for us now. That has to be enough. They sat like that for a long moment, Two people bound by grief and necessity, slowly learning that maybe, just maybe, they could build something from the broken pieces of what they'd lost. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the fire burned. And somewhere in the darkness, the ghost of Mateo Cruz watched over the family he'd left behind and the brother who'd promised to keep them safe. The next week passed quietly. Too quietly. Caleb kept expecting trouble. Kane's men showing up at his door, threats, violence, something. But nothing came. Just the usual rhythm of ranch work, of meals shared, of Rosa learning her letters and Isabella mending everything that could be mended and some things that probably couldn't. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, when Caleb was fixing a water pump behind the barn, he heard hoofbeats. He straightened, wiping grease from his hand onto his pants, and saw Tom Chen riding up the path on his old mare. Tom ran the laundry in town with his wife and daughter, had always been friendly in the distant way of people who didn't want trouble but didn't mind a nod and a good morning. Tom dismounted, his face tight with worry. "Caleb, need to talk to you." "What's wrong?" Tom glanced at the house, then lowered his voice. "It's about the woman you've got staying here, Isabella Cruz. There's talk in town." Caleb's jaw tightened. "What kind of talk?" Kane's been asking questions, lots of questions, about her husband, about where she came from, about why she's here. He's got people looking into Mateo Cruz's execution, pulling up old records, and he's telling anyone who'll listen that you're harboring a criminal element, that Mrs. Cruz might be wanted for aiding her husband's smuggling operation. That's horseshit, and he knows it. Of course it is. But Kane's the magistrate. His word carries weight, and he's saying if she doesn't leave town voluntarily, he'll have the sheriff bring her in for questioning. Tom paused. "Caleb, if he gets her in that jail, she might not come out. You understand what I'm saying?" Caleb understood perfectly. A Mexican widow, alone, no family, no protection. She could disappear into Kane's custody, and there'd be no one to ask questions except Caleb, and who'd listen to a one-armed rancher against a magistrate? "When?" "He's giving you 3 days to see reason and send her away. After that, he's coming out here with the sheriff." Tom's expression was pained. "I'm sorry, Caleb. I know you're trying to do right by her, but Kane's got power, and he's decided you're a problem." "Why? Why does he care so much about one widow and her child?" Tom hesitated, then said quietly, "My wife heard things. Rumors from the women who work in Kane's house. Apparently he was in Colorado last year. Some kind of business deal involving land claims and water rights. And apparently there was trouble with locals who were settled on land he wanted. Mexican families mostly, who'd been given homestead rights but didn't have the paperwork to prove it." Caleb felt ice slide down his spine. And Mateo Cruz was helping those families. He was helping them find legal aid, get their paperwork in order, fight back against the land grabs. Made himself a problem for men like Kane, who wanted empty territory they could claim. Tom met Caleb's eyes. Kane didn't just sign that execution order. He orchestrated it, and now the dead man's widow shows up in his town, in his county, and she knows things. She's a loose end. Jesus Christ. You need to get her out of here, Caleb, tonight, before Kane makes his move. I can't just send her into the cold with a 4-year-old child and nowhere to go. Then you're signing her death warrant. Tom's voice was harsh. And maybe yours too. Kane doesn't forgive. He doesn't forget. You get in his way, you end up in the ground or on the gallows. That's how it works here. That's how it's always worked. Tom climbed back on his horse, his face etched with regret. 3 days, Caleb. That's all you've got. I'm sorry. He rode away, leaving Caleb standing in the cold with his heart hammering and his mind racing. He thought of Isabella's face when she talked about Mateo's execution, the fear and rage warring in her eyes. He thought of Rosa's small hand in his, her trust that he'd keep her safe. He thought of the promise he'd made, both to Mateo and to himself. 3 days wasn't enough time to run. Wasn't enough time to fight. Wasn't enough time to do anything except watch while Kane destroyed what was left of Mateo's family. Unless Caleb stopped trying to run and started fighting back. He walked into the house where Isabella was cooking dinner, Rosa at her feet drawing pictures on the slate. They both looked up when he entered, and he saw Isabella's expression shift as she read his face. What happened? Caleb told her everything. About Tom's warning, about Kane's connection to Mateo's execution, about the 3 days they had before the sheriff came. He watched her face go pale, watched her pull Rosa close, watched the fear bloom in her eyes. But underneath the fear there was something else, something that looked a lot like the steel spine that had let her stand up to Cain in the middle of town. "We could run," she said quietly. "Take Rosa and disappear before Cain's men come." "Where would you go? How far would you get with no money, no supplies, and winter still holding on?" "Cain would find you in a week." "Then what do you suggest?" Caleb sat down at the table, his mind working through possibilities. "We fight. We make noise. We drag this into the light where Cain can't hide behind his power and his title. We find proof of what he did to Mateo, and we make sure everyone knows it." "That's insane. He'll kill us." "Maybe. But Mateo died because no one was willing to stand up and call Cain a murderer to his face. Died because good people kept their heads down and let evil win because fighting back was too dangerous." Caleb looked at Isabella, then at Rosa, who was watching them both with those huge dark eyes. "I'm not going to let that happen again. Not to you. Not to her. We stand and fight, or we die running. Those are the only choices Cain's left us." Isabella stared at him for a long moment. Then she reached up and touched Mateo's scarf at her throat. "If we do this, if we really do this, we need proof. Real proof. Something even Cain can't deny. Mateo's letter, the one he wrote me from jail, he mentions Cain by name. Cain will say it's lies from a condemned criminal. Then we find the witnesses who testified against Mateo. We make them tell the truth about who paid them to lie." Caleb stood, pacing the small kitchen with restless energy. "We need to go back to Colorado. Find Vicente Reyes and anyone else who testified. Get them to recant in front of a judge." "That's impossible. It would take weeks, maybe months, and Cain's giving us 3 days. "Then we buy more time." Caleb turned to face her. "Tomorrow, I ride to the county seat, file a formal complaint against Cain for harassment, demand a hearing. That'll force him to wait, at least for a little while, or risk looking like a tyrant in front of the territorial judge." "And what do I do?" "You and Rosa stay here. Keep the doors locked. Don't go anywhere alone. And if anyone comes, anyone, you take Rosa and you hide in the cellar under the barn. There's a trap door in the back stall covered with hay. It leads to an old whiskey storage room from when my father ran liquor during the dry years. It's cold and it's dark, but it's hidden. You stay there until I come back." Isabella nodded slowly. "And if you don't come back?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with all the terrible possibilities neither of them wanted to voice. Caleb thought of Mateo, thought of promises made and broken, thought of all the ways he'd failed people he'd loved. But he looked at Isabella, this fierce, frightened woman who'd walked across half the territory just to give her daughter a chance at survival, and knew he couldn't fail again. Wouldn't fail again. Even if it cost him everything. "Then you run," he said quietly. "You take Rosa and you run as far and as fast as you can. You find somewhere Cain's reach doesn't extend and you build a life there. You survive, for her, for Mateo. That's all that matters." Isabella crossed the room and stood in front of him, so close he could see the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Caleb Mercer," she said, and her voice shook only a little. "If you get yourself killed trying to save us, I will never forgive you. Do you understand? I won't lose another good man to this fight." "I understand." "Good." She stepped back, squaring her shoulders. "Then let's make sure we all survive this, together." Caleb left before dawn, riding hard for the county seat 30 miles east. The morning air cut like knives, but he barely felt it. His mind was too full of strategy, of words he'd need to say, of the slim chance that filing a formal complaint would buy them enough time to find real evidence against Cain. Behind him, Isabella stood at the window with Rosa pressed against her side, watching until horse and rider disappeared into the gray light. Then she closed the shutters, barred the door, and began preparing for whatever came next. She spent the day teaching Rosa her letters, cleaning the rifle Caleb had left propped by the door, and checking the cellar entrance in the barn 3 times to make sure she could find it in the dark if necessary. The trapdoor was exactly where Caleb had said, hidden under a pile of moldy hay in the back stall. She lifted it once, saw the ladder leading down into blackness, and felt her stomach twist. The thought of hiding down there with Rosa, waiting in the dark while men hunted them above, made her want to scream. But she'd done harder things. She'd watched them hang her husband. She'd walked 300 miles with a starving child. She could hide in a cellar if it meant keeping Rosa safe. Night fell with no sign of Caleb. Isabella made soup from the last of the dried beans, fed Rosa, and put her to bed with a story about a princess who turned into a bird and flew away from all the bad men who wanted to hurt her. Rosa fell asleep holding tight to her mother's hand, and Isabella sat in the dark listening to every creak of the house, every whisper of wind, every sound that might be hoofbeats coming up the road. Caleb returned just after midnight, his horse lathered and trembling. Isabella heard him coming and met him at the door with the rifle, then lowered it when she saw his face in the lamplight. He looked 10 years older than when he'd left, his expression grim as death. "What happened?" she asked as he stumbled inside, nearly falling into the chair by the fire. "I filed the complaint. The clerk accepted it. But when I left the courthouse, 3 of Cain's men were waiting." Caleb touched his ribs gingerly, and Isabella saw his shirt was torn and dark with what might have been blood. "They gave me a message. Cain says if we don't leave by tomorrow night, he's coming for us. Not the sheriff. Him. And he's not interested in arrests or trials this time." Isabella's hands shook as she helped him out of his coat. His ribs were bruised purple and black, and there was a gash on his shoulder that needed stitching. She fetched water and clean rags, her mind racing. "Then we run. Tonight. We take what we can carry, and we run." "No." Caleb caught her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong despite the beating he'd taken. "Running just delays it. Cain has men, resources, reach. He'll find us eventually, and when he does, we'll be somewhere even more isolated, even more vulnerable. At least here we know the ground, we can prepare." "Prepare for what? We can't fight Cain? We can't win." "Maybe not, but we can make him bleed. We can make him pay for what he did to Mateo." Caleb's eyes were fierce despite the pain. "And if we're going to die anyway, I'd rather die standing than running." Isabella wanted to argue, wanted to scream that dying standing was just dying stupid, that Rosa needed a mother more than she needed revenge. But she looked at Caleb's face and saw the same expression Mateo had worn the day he'd told her he was going to help the Reyes family cross the river, even though the ranchers had threatened him. The look of a man who'd found a line he wouldn't cross, a principle worth bleeding for. "What do you need me to do?" she asked quietly. "Sleep. Rest. Tomorrow, I need you to ride to Tom Chen's place and ask him to get word to everyone he trusts in town. Tell them what Cain did in Colorado. Tell them about Mateo. We need witnesses, people who'll stand up when this comes to a head. And if no one comes, if everyone's too afraid, then at least we tried." Caleb closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling at him. "That has to count for something." Isabella finished cleaning his wounds in silence, stitching the gash on his shoulder with neat, careful stitches she'd learned from her grandmother. When she was done, she helped him to his bed and covered him with blankets. He was asleep before she left the room, his breathing harsh and uneven. She stood in the doorway watching him for a long moment, this broken man who'd taken them in, who was willing to die for people he barely knew just because it was right. Mateo had called him brother. She was starting to understand why. The next morning came too fast and not fast enough. Isabella woke to Rosa shaking her shoulder, whispering that there were horses outside. She bolted upright, heart hammering, and grabbed the rifle. But when she looked out the window, she saw not Cain's men, but Tom Chen and 3 other townspeople. Martha Hendricks from the general store, Samuel Wright, the old soldier, and a Mexican woman Isabella didn't recognize. Caleb was already at the door, his face pale but determined despite the beating he'd taken. He let them in, and they crowded into the small main room, bringing cold air and the smell of fear with them. "We heard what happened at the county seat," Tom said without preamble. "Cain's been telling everyone you assaulted his men, that you're harboring a fugitive, that he's going to handle it personally." He paused. "But Martha did some digging, found something you need to see." Martha stepped forward, her face set in lines of deep disapproval. But this time, the disapproval wasn't directed at Isabella. She pulled a folded paper from inside her coat and handed it to Caleb. "My nephew works in the land office. I had him pull records from Cain's Colorado transactions last year. This is a deed transfer for a piece of property outside Denver. Look at the date." Caleb unfolded the paper and Isabella moved to stand beside him, reading over his shoulder. The deed was for 200 acres of prime riverfront land, transferred from a Miguel Santos to Hollis Kane. The date of transfer was 3 days after Mateo's execution. The sale price was listed as $1. $1, Caleb said slowly, for 200 acres of riverfront. That's not a sale, the Mexican woman spoke up, her accent thick but her English clear. That's a theft. Miguel Santos was my cousin. That land belonged to his family for 20 years. Kane wanted it because it controlled water rights for the whole valley. Miguel refused to sell. Then suddenly there were charges against Mateo Cruz, the man who'd been helping Miguel get proper papers filed. And 3 days after Cruz was hanged, Miguel signed over his land for $1. Kane threatened him, Isabella whispered. Told him what happened to people who didn't cooperate. That's my guess, the woman said. Miguel died 6 months later. Heart attack, they said. But he was only 40 years old and healthy as an ox before Kane got his claws in him. Caleb's hands tightened on the deed. This is proof. This connects Kane directly to Mateo's execution. He killed a man to steal land. It's not enough, Samuel Wright spoke for the first time, his voice rough with age and old tobacco. A deed transfer isn't proof of murder. A good lawyer, and Kane can afford the best, will explain it away as coincidence. You need more. You need the witnesses who testified against Cruz to admit they were coerced. You need documentation of Kane's threats. You need a pattern so clear even a crooked judge can't ignore it. Where are we supposed to get that in less than a day? Isabella demanded. You don't. Tom Chen met her eyes. But I know where Kane keeps his papers. He's got an office in his house, and he keeps records of everything, land deals, threats he's made, payments to witnesses. He's arrogant enough to document his own crimes because he thinks no one would dare use them against him. Caleb shook his head. Breaking into Kane's house is suicide. So is waiting for him to come here and kill you all. Martha's voice was sharp. Tom's right. Kane documents everything. If there's proof of what he did to Mateo Cruz, it'll be in that office. And if we can get it before he comes for you tonight, we can take it to the territorial judge. Force a real investigation. Why are you helping us? Isabella asked quietly, looking around at these people who barely knew her, who were risking Kane's wrath for a Mexican widow and her child. Why do you care what happens to us? Martha's face softened slightly. Because my husband was killed by powerful men who thought they could do whatever they wanted. Because I've watched Kane destroy good people for 30 years and nobody's ever stood up to him. Because maybe, just maybe, if we don't stop him now, he'll keep killing until there's nobody left with the spine to fight back. Samuel nodded. I lost both my boys in the war. Died fighting so people could be free, so justice could mean something. I'll be damned if I let some land-grabbing bastard turn their sacrifice into a joke. Tom just looked at Isabella and said simply, Mateo Cruz helped my family when we first came to this territory. Nobody else would rent to Chinese immigrants, but Cruz found us a place to live, vouched for us with the landlord. We owed him. Now we pay that debt. The Mexican woman crossed herself. And I owe Miguel. He was family. Kane killed him as surely as if he'd put a gun to his head. Someone needs to answer for that. Isabella felt tears burning in her eyes. She'd spent so long believing she and Rosa were alone, that no one cared what happened to people like them. But here were 4 strangers willing to risk everything to help her, to fight for justice even when justice seemed impossible. She looked at Caleb and saw the same realization in his face. They weren't alone. They'd never been alone. They'd just been too afraid to look up and see the allies standing beside them. All right, Caleb said. We do this. But we do it smart. Tom, you know Kane's house. What's the layout? They spent the next hour planning. Kane's house was on the edge of town, a 2-story mansion that was more statement than home. He kept an office on the 2nd floor northeast corner where he met with business associates and stored his files. There were servants, but they lived in a separate building out back, and Kane usually dismissed them by 9 in the evening because he didn't like people overhearing his business. The front door would be locked and watched, but there was a side entrance through the kitchen that Kane rarely bothered to secure because who would dare break into his house? I'll go, Caleb said. The rest of you stay clear. If this goes wrong, we're coming with you, Tom interrupted. All of us. You can't search an entire office one-handed, and you can't watch your back while you're doing it. We work together or we don't work at all. I'm coming too, Isabella said. No. Caleb's voice was flat. Absolutely not. Rosa needs you. If something happens, Rosa needs to know her mother fought for her father's memory instead of hiding in a cellar. Isabella's chin lifted, her eyes fierce. Martha can stay with Rosa. She'll be safe here with the door barred and the rifle loaded. But I'm going with you. Mateo was my husband. This is my fight. They stared at each other, locked in a battle of wills. Finally, Caleb nodded once, sharp and reluctant. Fine, but you stay behind me. You don't take risks. The second things go wrong, you run. Understood? Understood. Martha agreed to stay with Rosa, who was frightened but trying to be brave, clutching her mother's hand and whispering, "Come back, Mama. Promise you'll come back." "I promise, mija," Isabella whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. "I love you so much. Be good for Mrs. Hendricks." They left just after dusk, 5 people on horseback moving through the gathering dark like ghosts. The ride to town felt both too long and too short. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs, and she kept one hand on the small knife she'd tucked into her boot. Beside her, Caleb rode with his jaw set and his hook gleaming in the fading light. Behind them, Tom and Samuel and the woman whose name Isabella had learned was Lucia rode in grim silence. Kane's house loomed against the evening sky, all sharp angles and expensive glass. Lights burned in the windows downstairs, but the second floor was dark. They tied the horses in a copse of trees 100 yards away and approached on foot, moving through shadows and staying low. Tom led them to the side entrance, a narrow door half hidden behind a trellis that had probably been decorative once, but now just looked skeletal in the winter cold. The door was unlocked, just as Tom had predicted. They slipped inside one by one, finding themselves in a dark hallway that smelled of tobacco smoke and expensive whiskey. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. Somewhere closer, floorboards creaked under heavy footsteps. Caleb held up his hand for silence, then pointed to the stairs. They moved like thieves, which was exactly what they were, climbing toward the second floor where Kane kept his secrets. The office door was closed, but not locked. Caleb eased it open, and they filed into a room lined with bookshelves and filing cabinets, dominated by a massive desk that probably cost more than most families earned in a year. "Start searching," Caleb whispered. "Anything with Mateo's name, anything about Colorado land deals, anything that looks like a threat or a payoff. We've got maybe 20 minutes before someone realizes we're here." They scattered, pulling open drawers and rifling through papers. Isabella's hands shook as she flipped through file after file, seeing names and dates and amounts that spoke of a life built on stealing from people too weak to fight back. She found receipts for bribes paid to judges, letters threatening holdouts with violence, deeds transferred under suspicious circumstances. Kane had documented everything, just as Martha had said, an arrogant record of his own crimes, kept because he never thought he'd have to answer for them. Then Samuel made a small sound of triumph. "Here, found it." They gathered around as he spread papers across the desk, letters between Kane and a Colorado sheriff discussing the problem of Mateo Cruz and how he was interfering with legitimate business interests. A list of potential witnesses who could be persuaded to testify. Payment receipts to Vicente Reyes and 3 others dated 2 days before Mateo's trial. And a letter from Kane to the magistrate who'd signed the death warrant, promising a cut of the Santos land deal in exchange for swift justice. "This is it," Tom breathed. "This is everything we need. He ordered the execution. He paid for false testimony. He profited from murder." "Copy it," Caleb said, already pulling out paper and a pencil. "Write down everything word for word. We need duplicates in case—" The door slammed open. Hollis Kane stood in the doorway, a shotgun in his hands and murder in his eyes. Behind him, 3 of his men crowded into the hallway, all armed, all smiling like wolves who'd just cornered their prey. "Well, well," Kane said softly. "Breaking and entering. Theft. Trespassing. I'd say that's enough to hang the lot of you, wouldn't you?" His gaze found Isabella, and his smile widened. "Especially you, Mrs. Cruz. Seems like your whole family has a problem with respecting other people's property." Isabella felt ice flood her veins. She'd known this could happen, had prepared herself for it, but facing Kane with a gun in his hands and that look in his eyes made her realize how stupid they'd been. how impossibly outmatched. They were going to die here, all of them, and Rosa would be alone. But Caleb stepped in front of her, his body blocking Kane's line of fire. "You don't want to do this, Kane. These people are witnesses. You kill them, and word gets out. The territorial judge will investigate. You'll hang." "Will I?" Kane's voice was amused. "More likely, I'll explain how I came home to find burglars in my house, how I defended my property, how tragic it is that a one-armed rancher and his accomplices chose crime over honest work. No one will question it. No one will care. You're nobodies. You don't matter." "We have your files," Tom said, his voice shaking but steady. "We have proof of what you did to Mateo Cruz, to Miguel Santos, to everyone else you've destroyed. We have it all." Kane's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, calculation, measuring the threat. Then he shrugged. "Then I'll burn the proof, and I'll burn you with it. Makes no difference to me." He raised the shotgun, and Isabella knew in that moment that he meant it. He was going to kill them all, burn the evidence, and walk away clean because that's what men like him always did. They won because good people were too afraid to fight back. Because the world was built to protect power instead of justice. Because the window exploded. Glass shattered inward as something heavy crashed through it. Kane spun, and in that split second of distraction, Caleb moved. He lunged forward with his hook extended, catching the shotgun barrel and wrenching it upward. The gun went off with a deafening roar, blowing a hole in the ceiling. Plaster rained down as Kane stumbled backward, cursing. Through the broken window came Martha Hendricks, moving faster than any woman her age should be able to move, a heavy iron poker in her hands. Behind her, somehow impossibly, was Rosa, Martha's hand tight around the little girl's wrist. "You should have stayed at the ranch, you bastard!" Martha snarled at Kane. She swung the poker like she meant to cave in his skull, and Kane threw up his arms to block. "You should have left them alone." "What the hell?" Kane's men rushed forward, but Samuel and Tom met them with fists and fury. The office exploded into chaos, bodies slamming into furniture, papers flying, someone screaming. Isabella grabbed Rosa and pulled her close, shielding her daughter's body with her own. "What are you doing here? I told you to stay hidden." "Mrs. Martha said you needed help," Rosa sobbed against her mother's chest. "She said we had to be brave like Papa." Lucia had Kane's files clutched to her chest, backing toward the door. "Go! I've got the evidence. Get out!" Caleb and Kane were locked together, struggling for control of the shotgun. Kane was bigger, stronger, but Caleb had rage on his side, and the memory of Mateo's face as they dragged him to the gallows. He brought his knee up hard into Kane's gut, and the man doubled over with a grunt of pain. "You killed my brother," Caleb snarled, slamming Kane against the wall. "You destroyed his family. You need to answer for that. Your brother was trash," Kane spat, "and his widow's trash, and you're trash for helping them. This territory doesn't need people like you." He never finished the sentence. Isabella had pulled the knife from her boot, and now she pressed it against Kane's throat, her hand steady despite the fear coursing through her. "My husband was worth 1,000 men like you," she said quietly. "He died because he believed people deserved justice. So that's what we're going to give them, your justice, the kind you gave Mateo." For the first time, fear flickered across Kane's face. He stared at this small Mexican woman holding a knife to his throat and saw his own death looking back at him. "You won't do it," he whispered. "You're not a killer." "No," Isabella agreed, "but I'm willing to become one. For my daughter, for my husband's memory. Are you willing to bet your life that I won't?" The standoff lasted 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Then Tom Chen's voice cut through the chaos. "Sheriff's coming. I can see his lantern." Kane smiled despite the knife at his throat. "You're done. He's my man. He'll arrest you all, and I'll bury you so deep no one will ever find you." But when the sheriff burst through the door, he wasn't alone. Behind him came 6 townspeople, then a dozen, then more. Faces Isabella recognized from town and faces she'd never seen before, all crowding into Kane's house with makeshift weapons and determined expressions. At the front was a tall man in a judge's robes, his face carved from granite and anger. "Hollis Kane," the judge said, his voice carrying over the noise. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, bribery of witnesses, and theft through coercion. Drop your weapons, all of you." The room went still. Kane stared at the judge like he'd seen a ghost. Judge Morrison, what the hell are you doing here? My job. Unlike some people. Morrison gestured to the sheriff. Secure the prisoner and get those files, every last one of them. As the sheriff moved to obey, Kane's men backing down in the face of overwhelming numbers, the judge turned to Caleb and Isabella. Tom Chen rode to my house 3 hours ago, told me everything. I've been looking for a reason to bring Kane down for 20 years, but he's been too careful, too protected. You handed me that reason. He looked at the files in Lucia's hands. Is that what I think it is? Evidence, Caleb said. Everything you need to hang him. Then that's what we'll do. Come morning, Kane stands trial, real justice. Morrison's expression was grim. I can't promise it'll be easy. He's got friends in high places. But with this evidence, with witnesses willing to testify, we've got a chance. Isabella lowered her knife, her whole body shaking. Rosa clung to her, crying quietly. Around them, townspeople were securing Kane's men, gathering evidence, murmuring among themselves. Caleb moved to stand beside Isabella, his hand settling on her shoulder. You did it, he said quietly. You got justice for Mateo. We're not done yet, Isabella replied. But for the first time since her husband's death, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. They'd survived. They'd fought back. And maybe, just maybe, the world could be made to answer for what it had done to good people who deserved better. Outside, the night was cold and dark and full of uncertainty. But inside Kane's house, surrounded by allies they hadn't known they had, 3 people who'd started this fight alone realized they'd never have to fight alone again. The trial began 3 days later in the courthouse that doubled as a church on Sundays, the same building where Kane had once sat in judgment of others and decided their fates with the casual cruelty of a man who believed himself untouchable. Now he sat in chains at the defendant's table, his expensive suit rumpled, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. The courtroom was packed to the walls with townspeople, ranchers from outlying properties, families who'd lost land to Kane's schemes, and faces Isabella didn't recognize, but who all wore the same expression of desperate hope that maybe, finally, justice might mean something. Judge Morrison presided with the severity of a man who'd waited 20 years for this moment. He was old, past 70, with white hair and hands that shook slightly when he gripped his gavel, but his voice carried clear and strong when he called the court to order. Beside Isabella, Rosa sat quiet and wide-eyed, her small hand gripping her mother's with enough force to hurt. Caleb stood behind them, one hand resting on the back of Isabella's chair, his presence solid and reassuring in a room that felt like it might explode at any moment. The prosecutor was a thin young man named David Webb, who'd ridden in from the territorial capital specifically for this case. He looked nervous, kept adjusting his spectacles and shuffling papers, but when he stood to make his opening statement, his voice was steady enough. Your Honor, members of the jury, we are here today to address crimes that strike at the very heart of what it means to live in a civilized society. The defendant, Hollis Kane, stands accused of conspiracy to commit murder, bribery of witnesses, theft through coercion, and abuse of power. The evidence will show that Mr. Kane orchestrated the execution of an innocent man named Mateo Cruz for the sole purpose of stealing land from Mexican families who had every legal right to their property. We will prove that Mr. Kane paid witnesses to give false testimony, that he pressured a magistrate to sign a death warrant without proper trial, and that he profited directly from the murder of a good man whose only crime was helping people too poor and too powerless to help themselves. Kane's lawyer, a slick-looking man from Dallas named Theodore Blackwell, stood immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making inflammatory statements without foundation. My client is a respected businessman and magistrate who has served this community for 30 years. Overruled. Morrison's voice was cold as January ice. This is an opening statement, Mr. Blackwell. You'll have your turn. Sit down. Blackwell sat, but the look he shot Webb promised a fight. Isabella felt her stomach twist. She'd seen men like Blackwell before. Men who could make lies sound like truth and truth sound like delusion. Who could twist words until up was down and innocent men ended up hanging from nooses. She glanced at Caleb, saw the same worry in his face. The first witness was Tom Chen. He took the stand with visible nervousness, his hands clasped tight in his lap, but he spoke clearly when Webb asked him to describe what he'd witnessed. "I saw Mr. Kane threaten Mrs. Cruz in the street," Tom said. "Called her husband a criminal, said she was bringing criminal elements to town. He told Mr. Mercer that he'd regret harboring her, that people who got in his way ended up in the ground or on the gallows." Those were his exact words. "And did you believe he meant that literally?" Webb asked. "I did. Everyone in this territory knows Kane doesn't make idle threats. When he says you'll end up dead, he means it." Blackwell's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Chen, isn't it true that you've had business disputes with Mr. Kane in the past? That he refused to extend you credit at the grain warehouse?" "That's true, and isn't it also true that you hold a grudge against my client for that refusal? That you've been heard complaining about him in your establishment?" Tom's face flushed. "I complained because he tried to charge me double what he charged white business owners. That's not a grudge. That's objecting to being cheated." "So you admit you have negative feelings toward my client, that your testimony might be colored by personal bias?" "My testimony is colored by the truth. Kane threatened Mrs. Cruz. I heard it with my own ears." "Or perhaps you heard what you wanted to hear, Mr. Chen. No further questions." The pattern repeated with witness after witness. Martha Hendricks testified about the deed transfers she'd uncovered, about the suspicious timing of Miguel Santos's land sale. Blackwell questioned her eyesight, her memory, suggested she was a bitter old woman who'd never forgiven Kane for some long-ago slight. Samuel Wright testified about seeing Kane's men threaten people who refused to sell their property. Blackwell painted him as a drunk with failing faculties who couldn't be trusted to remember his own name, never mind details of conversations from months ago. By the third day, Isabella could feel hope beginning to curdle in her chest. Blackwell was good, too good, and the jury was starting to look uncertain. Kane sat at his table with a slight smile, like a man who knew the fix was in, who'd bought and paid for enough people that the outcome was never really in doubt. Then Webb called Lucia Mendoza to the stand. She wore her best dress, a faded blue thing that had been mended so many times it was more patches than original fabric, and she held her head high as she was sworn in. When Webb asked her to identify herself, she spoke in clear, careful English that held only a trace of accent. "My name is Lucia Mendoza. Miguel Santos was my cousin. He owned land in Colorado, good land by the river that his father had homesteaded 30 years ago. Hollis Kane wanted that land." "And what happened when your cousin refused to sell?" "Kane sent men. They told Miguel that accidents could happen, that sometimes settlers disappeared and nobody asked questions. Miguel was frightened, but he wouldn't sell. He had papers, legal papers, that proved the land was his. Then Mateo Cruz came. He was helping families like ours get our documentation in order, making sure we had everything filed proper with the territory. He was teaching Miguel how to read the legal papers so nobody could trick him into signing them away." "And then?" Lucia's voice hardened. "And then suddenly Mateo was arrested. They said he was a smuggler, said he'd been taking money to sneak criminals across state lines. It was all lies. Mateo Cruz never took a penny from anybody. He helped people because he believed it was right, not for profit. But they had witnesses, people who stood up in court and swore Mateo had taken their money." "Do you know any of those witnesses?" "I know Vicente Reyes. He was one of the families Mateo helped. Vicente testified that he'd paid Mateo $50 in gold for passage, but that was a lie. Vicente didn't have $50. None of us did. We were poor. That's why we needed help." Webb pulled out a document. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence this bank record showing a deposit of $100 into Vicente Reyes' account 3 days before Mateo Cruz's trial. The deposit was made by Hollis Kane." The courtroom erupted. Morrison banged his gavel, shouting for order. Kane was on his feet, his face purple with rage. "That's a forgery! I never—" "Sit down, Mr. Kane, or I'll hold you in contempt." Morrison's voice cracked like a whip. "Continue, Mr. Webb." "The evidence shows that Mr. Kane paid Vicente Reyes $100. 2 days later, Mr. Reyes testified that Mateo Cruz had taken $50 from him for illegal services. Mrs. Mendoza, do you believe Vicente was telling the truth?" "No. I believe he was scared. I believe Kane threatened him, maybe threatened his family, and then offered him money to lie. Vicente was a weak man." He chose survival over honor. Lucha's eyes found Cain across the courtroom. But I will not. My cousin Miguel signed over his land 3 days after Cruz was executed. Cain took everything from him, and 6 months later, Miguel was dead. The doctors said heart attack, but I know better. I know what it looks like when a man dies of a broken heart, of shame, of knowing he couldn't protect what was his. Blackwell's cross-examination was vicious. He attacked Lucia's credibility, her immigration status, her English, her relationship with her cousin. He suggested she was lying for money, for attention, for revenge. But Lucia didn't waver. She sat in that witness box with her spine straight and her eyes clear and answered every question with the same steady truth. When she finally stepped down, Isabella met her in the aisle. They didn't speak, just held each other for a moment. Two women who'd lost everything to the same evil man and had found the courage to stand up anyway. The next witness changed everything. Vicente Reyes walked into that courtroom like a man heading to his own execution, his face gray with fear and shame. He wouldn't look at Cain, wouldn't look at anyone except his own feet as he was sworn in. When Webb asked him if he'd testified at Mateo Cruz's trial, he nodded once, barely visible. "Mr. Reyes, did you tell the truth at that trial?" Silence. The courtroom held its breath. "Mr. Reyes, I remind you that you are under oath. Did you tell the truth when you testified that Mateo Cruz took money from you?" "No." The word came out as a whisper. "No, I lied." The courtroom exploded again. Morrison's gavel cracked like gunfire. Cain was shouting, Blackwell was objecting, and Vicente Reyes sat in the witness box with tears streaming down his face. "Order! I will have order!" Morrison's voice cut through the chaos. When the room finally quieted, he turned to Vicente. "Mr. Reyes, you are admitting to perjury in a capital case. Do you understand the implications of that?" "I understand." Vicente's voice was stronger now, as if confessing had freed something in him. "I lied. Mateo Cruz never took money from me. He helped my family out of kindness, out of goodness. He was a saint compared to men like Cain." "Then why did you lie?" Webb asked gently. "Because Cain's men came to my house. They said if I didn't testify, they'd burn my home with my children inside. They said accidents happened to people who didn't cooperate. Then they gave me money, $100, and said it was just to help me remember things correctly. I was a coward. I chose my children's lives over an innocent man's. I've lived with that shame every day since." Vicente finally looked up, his eyes finding Isabella. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Your husband was a good man, and I helped kill him. I will carry that sin to my grave." Isabella couldn't breathe. She'd known intellectually that the witnesses had been coerced or bribed, but hearing Vicente say it, hearing the shame and guilt in his voice, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Mateo had died because good people had been too afraid to do the right thing. He'd died because the world rewarded cowardice and punished courage. He died alone and afraid, screaming his innocence while people who knew the truth stayed silent. She stood up, and the courtroom went quiet. Rosa grabbed for her mother's skirts, frightened, but Isabella gently freed herself and walked to the witness box. She stood in front of Vicente Reyes, this man who'd helped murder her husband, and looked him in the eyes. "Do you have children, Mr. Reyes?" she asked quietly. "3. 2 girls and a boy. I have one daughter, Rosa. She was 3 years old when they hanged her father. She doesn't remember much about him now. His voice, his laugh, the way he used to call her his little desert flower. Those memories fade. But she'll remember forever that her father died because people were too afraid to tell the truth." Isabella's voice broke. "I don't forgive you, Mr. Reyes. I don't think I can, but I understand why you did it. And I pray that you teaching your children to be braver than you were, to stand up even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous. That's all we can do. Make sure the next generation is better than we were." She turned and walked back to her seat, and the silence in that courtroom was absolute. Even Cain had stopped his muttering, struck silent by the dignity of a woman who had every right to scream for vengeance but chose grace instead. The next witness was Caleb. He took the stand with visible discomfort, his empty right sleeve pinned and his hook resting on the rail of the witness box. Webb had him identify himself, then asked about his relationship with Mateo Cruz. "He saved my life during the war," Caleb said simply. "Dragged me 3 miles to a field hospital after I took shrapnel to the arm. I wouldn't be here without him." "And did he write to you before his execution?" "Yes." Caleb pulled the letter from his coat pocket, the paper soft from handling. "He asked me to take care of his wife and daughter if they ever needed help. He said he was being executed for crimes he didn't commit, but there was nothing to be done. He said the magistrate who signed his death warrant was in Kane's pocket, that the whole thing was arranged to steal land from families who couldn't fight back." "Did he name Hollis Kane specifically?" "He did. Said Kane wanted him dead because he was helping people keep their property, helping them understand their legal rights. Said Kane couldn't steal from people who knew what they owned and how to protect it." Webb entered the letter into evidence. Blackwell tried to argue it was hearsay, the ravings of a condemned criminal, but Morrison allowed it over his objections. Then Blackwell stood for cross-examination, and his smile was sharp as broken glass. "Mr. Mercer, you've testified that Mateo Cruz saved your life. Would it be fair to say you feel indebted to him?" "It would. And that debt, that feeling of obligation, might it color your perception of the facts? Might it make you willing to believe accusations against my client even without solid proof?" "I believe the accusations because they're true. The proof is in those files we found in Kane's office. Payment records, threatening letters, documentation of land theft. That's not perception, that's fact. Files obtained through illegal breaking and entering. Files that could have been tampered with, altered, even planted by people with an agenda." Blackwell's voice was smooth. "Mr. Mercer, isn't it true that you were court-martialed during the war for striking a superior officer?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Yes." "And the charges were dropped only because that officer was later found to be selling military supplies for personal profit?" "That's correct." "So you have a history of acting on your own judgment, of deciding you know better than authority, of taking justice into your own hands. Isn't that what you did here? Decided my client was guilty and broke into his home to find evidence to support your preconceived conclusion?" "I broke into his home because he threatened to kill a widow and her child, because he'd already killed one innocent man and was planning to kill more, because someone had to stop him and the law wasn't going to do it." "The law wasn't going to do it, or you didn't trust the law?" "There's a difference, Mr. Mercer. One is necessity, the other is vigilantism." Caleb leaned forward, his eyes hard. "I trusted the law right up until the moment I watched it fail Mateo Cruz, watched it execute an innocent man because a powerful criminal paid for a death warrant. So yeah, maybe I didn't trust the law after that. Maybe I decided that if the system was broken, someone had to fix it. You can call that vigilantism if you want. I call it doing what's right when nobody else will." The two men stared at each other across the courtroom, and the air between them crackled with tension. Finally, Blackwell shook his head. "No further questions." The final witness was Kane himself. He took the stand with the confidence of a man who'd talked his way out of trouble his whole life, who believed that charm and money and power were all the defense he needed. Blackwell walked him through his version of events. He was a respected businessman. He'd never ordered anyone's death. The files from his office were either forgeries or taken out of context. Vicente Reyes was lying for money or revenge or both. "Mr. Kane," Blackwell said, "did you pay Vicente Reyes to give false testimony against Mateo Cruz?" "Absolutely not. I've never even met the man." "Did you threaten Miguel Santos to force him to sell his land?" "Of course not. Miguel was a business associate. We negotiated a fair price for his property. The $1 sale price was a legal formality. I'd already paid him separately in cash." "Do you have documentation of that payment?" Kane spread his hands apologetically. "Unfortunately, no. Miguel preferred cash transactions, didn't trust banks. It was irregular, but I accommodated his wishes." It was smooth, practiced, almost believable. Isabella watched the jury's faces and saw doubt creeping back in. Kane was good at this. He'd spent his whole life lying, and he made it look like truth. Then Webb stood for cross-examination. He was young and he was nervous, but he'd studied those files for 3 days straight, and he knew every detail of Kane's crimes better than Kane did. "Mr. Kane, you testified that you never met Vicente Reyes. Is that correct?" That's correct. Webb pulled out a photograph. Then can you explain this picture taken at the Colorado Territorial Fair in July of 1878? That's you on the left, yes? And that's Vicente Reyes standing next to you, receiving an award for his agricultural work. An award you presented personally as magistrate of the district. Kane's face went white. I present dozens of awards. I can't be expected to remember every person. So you did meet him. You just didn't remember. Let's move on. You testified that you paid Miguel Santos separately in cash for his land. How much did you pay him? $2,000. Fair market value. And you have no documentation of this? As I said, Miguel preferred. Mr. Kane, Miguel Santos's wife testified yesterday that her husband never saw a penny beyond the $1 on the deed. She said you threatened to destroy their family if Miguel didn't sign. Are you calling her a liar? I'm saying she's mistaken. Grief can do strange things to memory. Let's talk about Mateo Cruz. You testified you had nothing to do with his execution, but here's a letter from you to Magistrate William Hawkins in Colorado dated 2 weeks before Cruz's arrest. You write, the Cruz problem must be dealt with immediately. He's turning these people into lawyers, making them understand their rights. If we don't act now, we'll lose the Santos property and others like it. How do you explain that letter, Mr. Kane? That's been taken out of context. Context, I see. Here's another letter, dated 3 days before Cruz's trial. I've secured testimony from 4 witnesses. The payment will be made upon successful conviction. What payment, Mr. Kane? What were you paying for? Legal fees. I was helping the prosecution. You were helping them by bribing witnesses to lie. Webb's voice cracked like thunder. You orchestrated the murder of an innocent man because he was helping poor families keep their property. You used your power as magistrate to sign death warrants and steal land. You built your empire on the bodies of people who couldn't fight back. And now you sit here and lie, under oath, because you think you're above the law, because you think you'll always get away with it. Kane was sweating now, his composure cracking. You don't understand how business works. You don't understand what it takes to build something in this territory. I understand murder. I understand theft. I understand that you killed Mateo Cruz and Miguel Santos, and God knows how many others, and you did it for money, for land, for power. Webb turned to the jury. This man is a killer. The evidence proves it. Vicente Reyes confirmed it, and unless we hold him accountable, he'll keep killing until there's nobody left brave enough to stand against him. The courtroom was silent. Kane sat in the witness box with his face red and his hand shaking, stripped of his polish, revealed as exactly what he was, a bully and a thief and a murderer who'd gotten away with it for too long. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Isabella spent that time in the church across the street with Rosa, asleep on her lap, and Caleb standing guard by the door. She prayed for the first time since Mateo's death, not for vengeance but for justice, for the world to finally acknowledge that her husband's life had mattered, that his death had been wrong. When the bell rang, summoning them back to the courthouse, her hands were shaking so badly that Caleb had to help her stand. They filed back into the courtroom with everyone else, packed into the space like sardines, all of them holding their breath. The jury foreman was a rancher named Dutch McCarthy, a hard man with a weathered face who'd lost his own son to one of Kane's schemes. He stood and met Morrison's eyes without flinching. Have you reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of bribery of witnesses, guilty. On the charge of theft through coercion, guilty. On all counts, guilty. The courtroom exploded. People were cheering, crying, shouting. Kane was on his feet screaming that this was a travesty, that they'd all pay, that his lawyers would appeal, and he'd bury every last one of them. Blackwell was already gathering papers, his face grim, but Morrison just banged his gavel and waited for silence. Hollis Kane, he said when the room finally quieted, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers. It is the judgment of this court that you be remanded to custody and held for sentencing. That sentencing will take place tomorrow at dawn. This court is adjourned. As the bailiff dragged Kane away, still screaming threats, Isabella sank into her chair and wept. Rosa climbed into her lap, crying too, though she didn't fully understand why. Caleb's hand settled on Isabella's shoulder, his grip tight enough to hurt, and she reached up to cover it with her own. "We did it," she whispered. "Matteo, we did it. We got justice for you." Around them, people were celebrating, but Isabella just held her daughter and cried for the man who should have been here to see this, who died believing the world would never care that he tried to do right. She cried for Miguel Santos and everyone else Cain had destroyed. And she cried for herself, for the woman she'd been before all this, who'd believed that goodness was enough, that justice would prevail without people having to bleed for it. That night, they stayed in town at Martha Hendrick's house. Martha made dinner while Rosa played with a cloth doll someone had given her, and Isabella sat at the table watching her daughter laugh for the first time in what felt like forever. Caleb stood at the window, staring out at the dark street, his expression unreadable. "What are you thinking?" Isabella asked quietly. "That it's not over. Cain's lawyers will appeal. They'll drag this out for months, maybe years. And even if the conviction holds, even if they hang him, there are more like him out there. More powerful men who think they can do whatever they want." "I know." Isabella stood and moved to stand beside him. "But we beat one. That's more than most people ever do. And maybe if enough people see that it's possible, that the powerful can be held accountable, things will start to change." That's a lot of hope to rest on one verdict. Hope is all we have. It's all Matteo had when he was helping those families, all he left us when he died. We can honor that. We can keep fighting, not for revenge, but for the world he believed was possible. She paused, then added softly, "And we don't have to fight alone anymore. We have people. We have community. We have each other." Caleb looked down at her, this small, fierce woman who'd walked through hell and somehow come out the other side, still believing in goodness. "What happens now, after the sentencing? We go home, we plant crops. We raise Rosa, we build something that would make Matteo proud." Isabella smiled, and it was tired but genuine. "We live, Caleb. That's the best revenge against men like Cain. We survive and we live, and we refuse to let them destroy us." The next morning, they stood in the courthouse square with half the town as the sun rose over the prairie. Cain was brought out in chains, his expensive suit replaced with prison gray, his face pale but defiant. Morrison read the sentence in a voice that carried across the silent crowd: "Death by hanging for conspiracy to commit murder, to be carried out immediately." Cain spat curses at them all, swore his lawyers would overturn this, that he'd see every last one of them destroyed. But when they put the noose around his neck, his voice finally faltered. He looked at Isabella standing in the front row with Rosa pressed against her side and Caleb's hand on her shoulder, and something that might have been fear flickered across his face. "You think you've won," he said, his voice hoarse. "You think justice means something. But men like me, we always come back. There's always someone else willing to take what they want and damn the consequences." "Maybe," Isabella said quietly, "but we'll be here to stop them. Every time. As many times as it takes." They pulled the lever. The trapdoor dropped. And Hollis Cain, who'd built an empire on stolen land and murdered innocents, finally paid for his crimes at the end of a rope. Isabella didn't watch the end. She turned away and gathered Rosa close, covering her daughter's eyes. Behind her, she heard the crowd's reaction, some cheering, some gasping, some just silent. She felt Caleb's presence beside her, solid and steady. "Is it over?" Rosa whispered. "Yes, mija, it's over. We can go home now." They rode out of town that afternoon with Tom and Martha and Lucia following behind, bringing supplies and good wishes and promises to visit. The prairie stretched wide and endless under a winter sky that was finally starting to show hints of spring. Rosa fell asleep between her mother and Caleb, exhausted by days of tension and fear. Isabella watched her daughter's peaceful face and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the day they'd hanged Matteo. Justice hadn't brought him back. It hadn't erased the grief or the anger or the hollow place his death had carved in her heart. But it meant his death hadn't been for nothing. It meant the world had finally acknowledged that his life had value, that the people he'd tried to help mattered, that truth could win against power if enough people were willing to fight for it. As they approached the ranch, Isabella saw the small house with new eyes. It wasn't much, a few rooms, a failing barn, land that needed work, but it was home. It was safety. It was the place where three broken people had found each other and built something worth protecting. "Thank you," she said to Caleb as he helped her down from the wagon. "For everything. For taking us in. For fighting for us. For being the man Mateo knew you were." Caleb looked uncomfortable with the gratitude, the way he always did when anyone acknowledged the good he'd done. "You don't need to thank me. Your family. I know, that's why I'm thanking you, because you chose us as family when you didn't have to. Because you gave Rosa a father when hers was taken away. Because you honored Mateo's memory better than I ever could have alone." Rosa woke up then, rubbing her eyes and looking around at the ranch with dawning recognition. "We're home? We're home, mija. Can I help Mr. Caleb feed the chickens?" "After dinner. Right now we need to unload the wagon." They worked together as the sun set, carrying supplies into the house, settling back into the rhythm of ranch life. And when the work was done and Rosa was asleep in the bedroom that was finally, truly hers, Isabella and Caleb sat by the fire with coffee warming their hands and the silence comfortable between them. "What do we do now?" Caleb asked. "Really?" Isabella thought about it, about the life stretching ahead of them, about the ranch and the town and the community they'd found. "We do what Mateo would have done. We help people. We fight for what's right. We teach Rosa to be brave and kind and to never back down from bullies. And we build something good out of all this grief." "That's a tall order." "Yes, but we've done harder things." She smiled at him across the fire. "And we'll do it together. All three of us. The family Mateo left behind, and the brother who kept his promise." Outside, the wind had finally stopped howling. The brutal winter was loosening its grip, and somewhere in the dark, spring was gathering strength for its return. Inside the small house on the Texas prairie, three people who'd survived the worst the world could throw at them finally began to believe that maybe, just maybe, survival wasn't enough. Maybe they could actually live. Spring came slowly to the Texas panhandle, arriving not with fanfare but with quiet persistence. The frost retreated inch by stubborn inch, revealing grass that had survived the winter buried beneath ice and snow. Caleb was the first to notice the change, standing in the barn doorway one morning in late March and seeing actual green poking through the brown. It seemed impossible after the brutal months they'd endured, but there it was, proof that nothing stayed frozen forever, that even the harshest winter eventually had to yield to something gentler. He was still staring at that green grass when Isabella found him, Rosa trailing behind her with a basket of eggs clutched carefully in both hands. The little girl had grown in the months since the trial, not just taller, but stronger, her face filling out with regular meals and her eyes losing that haunted wariness that had made her seem so much older than her years. "Planning to stand there all day watching the grass grow?" Isabella asked, amusement coloring her voice. "Because if you are, there's a fence that needs mending and a plow that won't sharpen itself." Caleb turned to face her, and something in his expression made her smile fade. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about what comes next. About what we do with this place now that we're not just surviving anymore." "What do you mean?" He gestured to the ranch around them, the small house and failing barn and 11 head of cattle that barely constituted a herd. "This isn't enough. Not for 3 people. Not for a future. We need something more, something that matters. Something Mateo would have built if he'd lived to do it." Isabella set down the bucket she'd been carrying and moved to stand beside him, following his gaze across the property. "What are you proposing?" "The trade road runs right past our gate. You've seen the travelers, people heading west looking for land, families trying to start over, folks who've got nothing but hope and determination. They need places to stop, places to rest and get a meal and maybe hear that things might work out after all." Caleb paused, then said quietly, "I want to build an inn, a real one, with rooms and a kitchen and a barn big enough to stable horses. A place where people who've been knocked down can stop and catch their breath before they keep going." Isabella stared at him, her mind working through the logistics, the costs, the sheer impossibility of what he was suggesting. They barely had enough to keep themselves fed through the summer. Building an inn would take money they didn't have, labor they couldn't afford, and time that would need to be stolen from the daily work of keeping the ranch running. It was absurd. It was impractical. It was exactly the kind of dream Mateo would have chased with both hands and a heart full of hope. "You're serious," she said finally. I am. I know it sounds crazy. I know we don't have the resources, but people in town, they'd help. Tom and Martha and all the others who stood with us at the trial, they believe in what we did and standing up to Cain. If we tell them we want to build something good from all that pain, something that helps people instead of hurting them, I think they'd be willing to invest. Rosa tugged on her mother's skirt. What's an inn, Mama? Isabella knelt down to her daughter's level, smoothing Rosa's dark hair back from her face. It's a place where travelers can stay when they're tired, where they can have a warm meal and a soft bed, and maybe make friends with people who understand what it's like to be far from home. Like we were far from home when we came here. Yes, mija. Exactly like that. Rosa considered this with the seriousness of a child who'd learned early that words had weight. Papa would like that. He always helped people who were far from home. The simple truth of it hit Isabella like a fist to the chest. Rosa barely remembered Mateo. Most of her memories were stories Isabella had told her, images built from words rather than lived experience. But somehow she'd absorbed the essential truth of who her father had been, what he'd stood for. He'd helped people. That was his legacy, distilled down to 3 words a 5-year-old could understand. Yes, Isabella said, her voice thick. He would like that very much. She stood and turned to Caleb, seeing the hope and fear warring in his face. He was asking her to gamble everything they'd fought for on a dream that might fail, that would certainly be harder than anything they'd attempted so far. But looking at him, this one-armed rancher who'd taken in strangers and fought a murderer and rebuilt his own broken life into something worth living, she realized the gamble had already been made. They'd bet everything on each other the day she'd knelt at his gate begging for food. This was just the next hand in a game they were already playing. All right, she said, let's build an inn. Let's build something that would make Mateo proud. The smile that broke across Caleb's face was like sunrise after a long night. He reached out with his left hand and took hers, squeezing once, hard. Thank you for believing in this, for believing in me. You made me believe again, Caleb. After Mateo died, I thought believing in anything was just setting myself up to be hurt. But you showed me that some things are worth the risk. She squeezed back. Now let's go figure out how to convince a town full of practical ranchers to invest in an impossible dream. It turned out the town needed less convincing than they'd expected. When Caleb and Isabella rode into Redemption 3 days later with their plans sketched out on paper and their hearts in their throats, they found people already talking about ways to help. Martha Hendricks had been spreading the word, and by the time they called a meeting at the church, half the town showed up to listen. Tom Chen stood first. My family will contribute lumber. We've got a stand of timber on our back 40 that's been waiting for a purpose. This seems like a good one. Samuel Wright offered labor. I'm too old to do much heavy lifting, but I can still work a saw and hammer nails. Count me in. Lucia Mendoza pledged to help with cooking and cleaning once the inn was built. My cousin would want his memory to be part of something like this. Let me honor him by feeding the people you shelter. One by one, people stood and offered what they could. Materials, labor, money, expertise. A young carpenter named James McCarthy, Dutch's surviving son, volunteered to oversee the construction. A widow named Ellen Price said she'd donate bedding and linens from her late husband's store. Even people who'd been neutral during the trial with Cain, who'd kept their heads down and their opinions quiet, came forward now to be part of something they could be proud of. By the end of the meeting, they had enough commitments to start building. Not enough to finish, not by a long shot, but enough to begin. Sometimes, Isabella was learning, beginning was the hardest part. Once you started, once you put that first nail in that first board, momentum could carry you further than you'd thought possible. They broke ground in April. Caleb marked out the foundation while James McCarthy directed the placement of support beams. They decided to build on the spot where the old barn had stood, expanding outward to create a 2-story structure with 6 guest rooms upstairs, a large common room and kitchen downstairs, and a new barn out back for travelers' horses. It was ambitious, maybe too ambitious, but they'd learned that playing it safe was just another way of dying slowly. Rosa appointed herself assistant to everyone, carrying tools and water, holding boards steady while men nailed them in place, asking 1,000 questions about why things had to be done certain ways. She was fearless in a way that made Isabella's heart ache, climbing ladders and exploring half-finished rooms with the confidence of a child who'd learned that not all adults were dangerous, that some would catch you if you fell. "She's so much like Matteo," Isabella said to Caleb one evening as they watched Rosa chase fireflies in the dusk, her laughter bright as bells. "That absolute certainty that the world will be good to her if she's good to it. I lost that after he died. I don't know if I'll ever get it back." "You don't need to be exactly like him," Caleb said. "You just need to make sure she knows he existed, that he mattered. The rest will sort itself out." Isabella looked at him, at this man who'd become so central to her life that she couldn't remember what it had felt like before he was there. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Why haven't you ever asked for more? From this? From us? You've given us everything, your home, your safety, your life. You fought Cain knowing you might die. You're building this inn that will take years to profit from. But you've never once asked what you get out of it beyond the satisfaction of keeping a promise to a dead man." She paused. "Don't you want something for yourself, Caleb? Don't you deserve something beyond debt and duty?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them had been brave enough to voice before. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, staring at the darkening sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I was dead before you came here. Not literally, but in every way that mattered. I'd given up on the idea that my life could be anything but an apology for surviving when better men died. Then you showed up at my gate with Rosa in your arms, and suddenly I had a reason to get up in the morning. You gave me that, Isabella. You and Rosa. So when you ask what I get out of this, the answer is everything. I get to matter again. I get to be part of something bigger than my own guilt and grief. That's not nothing. That's everything. But it's not just about us. It can't be just about keeping Matteo's memory alive. At some point, it has to be about what you want, what you need." He turned to face her fully, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "What if what I want is this? This family we've built, this life we're creating? What if I want to watch Rosa grow up strong and brave? What if I want to build this inn with you and help people and sit on the porch when we're old and remember the day we beat a killer? What if all of that is enough? And what about love?" The words slipped out before Isabella could stop them, too raw and too honest. "What about wanting someone to hold you at night and tell you you're enough exactly as you are? What about needing more than duty and purpose? What about being happy, Caleb, not just useful?" The silence stretched taut as wire. Rosa's laughter drifted across the yard, innocent and unaware of the adult complications unfolding on the porch. Caleb's hand moved to cover Isabella's where it rested on the railing, his calloused palm warm against her fingers. "I am happy," he said quietly. "Happier than I ever thought I'd be again. And if you're asking whether I feel more for you than debt or obligation..." He broke off, shaking his head. "Isabella, I fell in love with you somewhere between watching you scrub my barn floor and seeing you hold a knife to Cain's throat. I love the way you're fierce and gentle at the same time, the way you fight for Rosa with everything you have, the way you've taken this broken ranch and started turning it into something that matters. I love you. I have for months. I just didn't think I had the right to say it out loud." Isabella felt tears slide down her face, but they weren't sad tears. "Why didn't you think you had the right?" "Because I'm not Matteo. I'll never be him. And I didn't want you to think I was trying to replace him or take advantage of your grief. You've lost so much. I didn't want to be one more man demanding something from you when you'd already given everything." She turned her hand in his, lacing their fingers together. "You're right. You're not Matteo, but that's not a failing, Caleb. That's just truth. Matteo was my first love, and I'll carry him in my heart until I die. But he's gone. And you're here. You're alive and real, and you've shown me that I can build a life after loss, that I can love again without betraying his memory. That's not replacing him. That's surviving. That's choosing to live instead of just existing. Are you saying..." He couldn't seem to finish the question. "I'm saying I love you too. I don't know when it happened. Maybe it was when you gave Rosa your bed that first night. Maybe it was when you rode to the county seat to buy us time, even though you knew Cain's men might kill you. Maybe it was watching you teach my daughter to write her letters with so much patience and care. But somewhere along the way, you stopped being the man who owed Matteo a debt and became the man I can't imagine living without. Caleb pulled her close with his one arm, and she wrapped both of hers around him, feeling his heart hammer against her cheek. They stood like that as the night deepened around them, two broken people who'd found each other in the wreckage and built something stronger than either of them had been alone. "I want to marry you," Caleb said into her hair. "When you're ready, if you're ever ready, I want Rosa to be my daughter-in-law as well as love. I want to build this inn with you and fill it with people and grow old watching you be magnificent, but only if that's what you want too. Only if I'm not asking too much." Isabella pulled back just enough to see his face. "You're not asking too much. You're asking for exactly what I want to give. Yes, Caleb Mercer. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to all of it." He kissed her then, gentle and careful, like she was something precious that might break. She kissed him back harder, wanting him to know she wasn't fragile, that she'd survived too much to shatter now. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Rosa was standing at the bottom of the porch steps watching them with a smile that was far too knowing for a 5-year-old. "Does this mean Mr. Caleb is going to be my papa now?" she asked. Isabella laughed through her tears. "Would you like that, mija?" Rosa considered this seriously, then nodded. "I think Papa, my first Papa, would like it. He'd want someone to take care of us, someone brave and good like Mr. Caleb." Caleb knelt down with some difficulty, bringing himself to Rosa's eye level. "I can never replace your father, Rosa. He was a hero, and I'm just a one-armed rancher trying to do right. But if you'll let me, I'd like to be your papa too. Not instead of Matteo Cruz, but alongside him." Because a child can have two fathers, one who gave her life and taught her courage, and one who's here now to help her grow up strong. Rosa launched herself into his arms with enough force to nearly knock him over. "Yes, yes, you can be my papa. Can I call you Papa Caleb?" "You can call me whatever feels right to you. Papa Caleb it is." She pulled back, her face suddenly serious. "But you have to promise not to die like my first papa did. You have to stay and help build the inn and teach me to read big books and be here when I'm grown up. Promise?" Caleb's eyes met Isabella's over Rosa's head, and she saw her own fear reflected there. They both knew promises like that couldn't be kept, that life was too unpredictable and death too certain. But they also knew that children needed promises, needed to believe the adults in their lives would be there to catch them. So Caleb held Rosa tight and said, "I promise to stay for as long as I possibly can, to fight for you and your mama with everything I have, to be here for every important moment that I'm able to witness. That's the best promise I can make. And I swear on my honor I'll keep it." It seemed to be enough. Rosa nodded solemnly, then squirmed down and ran back to chase fireflies, her child's mind already moving past heavy adult conversations to the immediate joy of the moment. Isabella and Caleb watched her go, hands clasped, both thinking about the future they were promising to build and the ghosts who'd made it possible. They were married in June, on a Sunday morning when the prairie grass was gold and green and the sky was so blue it hurt to look at. Judge Morrison performed the ceremony in the half-finished inn, surrounded by the people who'd helped them survive Cain and build towards something better. Rosa stood between them holding a bouquet of desert marigolds she'd picked herself, the same flowers that had been stitched into Matteo's scarf. Isabella wore that scarf around her shoulders, honoring the man who'd brought them all together even in death. "Do you, Caleb Mercer, take Isabella Cruz to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do." "And do you, Isabella Cruz, take Caleb Mercer to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Isabella looked at Caleb, at his scarred face and missing arm and eyes full of love, and thought of the impossible journey that had led her here. From a jail cell where her first husband had died screaming innocence, to a frozen road where she'd knelt begging for food, to a trial where justice had finally mattered, to this moment where she was choosing love again despite knowing how badly it could hurt to lose it. "I do," she said clearly. "With all my heart, I do." The celebration afterward was loud and joyful, with music and dancing and enough food to feed everyone twice over. Martha had baked a cake, Tom had contributed bottles of rice wine, and someone had brought a fiddle that squeaked and warbled but made people dance anyway. Rosa ran wild with the other children, her laughter bright enough to chase away ghosts. Isabella and Caleb danced awkwardly in the unfinished common room, his one arm around her waist, her hands clasped behind his neck, both of them stepping on each other's feet and not caring at all. "I never thought I'd have this again," Isabella whispered against his chest. "This feeling of hope, of joy. Thank you for giving it back to me. Thank you for teaching me I deserved it in the first place." The inn was finished by autumn. They called it the Last Lantern because it was the last light people saw before the long, empty stretch of prairie, and the first light that welcomed them back to civilization. The sign above the door showed a lantern with a flame shaped like a desert marigold, painted by Rosa with more enthusiasm than skill, but treasured for exactly that reason. The first guests arrived on a cold October evening, a family heading west with everything they owned packed into a single wagon. The mother was pregnant and exhausted, the father trying to hide how little money they had left. 3 children clung to their parents with the wide eyes of people who'd been traveling too long in a world that wasn't kind to the poor. Isabella met them at the door with Rosa peeking out from behind her skirts. "Welcome to the Last Lantern. You look like you could use a hot meal and a soft bed." The father cleared his throat nervously. "How much per night? We don't have much, but we can pay something." "How about you help with morning chores instead?" Caleb interrupted, appearing from the kitchen with flour dusting his shirt. "We're short-handed with planting season coming up. A few hours of work seems like fair trade for a night's lodging and meals." The parents exchanged glances, hope and disbelief warring on their faces. "You'd do that? For strangers?" "Someone did it for us once," Isabella said simply. "Seems only right to pass it on." They fed the family beans and cornbread and apple pie, gave them the best room upstairs, and listened to their story of drought and failed crops and determination to start over somewhere the land might be kinder. The father had been a teacher before hard times forced him west. Caleb immediately asked if he'd be willing to teach Rosa and the other children in the area in exchange for supplies and lodging. The man nearly cried with gratitude. Word spread fast. Within a month, the Last Lantern was hosting travelers most nights, families heading west, cowboys between jobs, widows trying to start over, soldiers coming home from wars that had ended years ago but still lived in their heads. Isabella cooked massive pots of stew and soup, taught Rosa to help set tables and change bedding, and listened to stories from people who just needed someone to witness their struggles. Caleb maintained the property, fixed wagons for travelers who couldn't afford professional repairs, and somehow found time to start a small school in the barn for children whose families were passing through. Lucia came 3 times a week to help cook and clean, always wearing Miguel's watch pinned to her dress as a reminder of why this work mattered. Tom Chen sent his daughter to help serve meals and learn the business of hospitality. Samuel Wright carved toys for visiting children and told stories about wars that made violence sound terrifying instead of glorious. Martha Hendricks invested in expansion, helping them add 4 more rooms and a larger kitchen. The inn became more than just a place to sleep. It became a community hub, a place where people could share information about where to find work or good land, where doctors passing through could treat the sick for barter instead of cash, where letters could be sent and received by people with no permanent address. It became the kind of place Mateo Cruz would have built if he'd lived, a refuge for the lost and struggling, proof that compassion wasn't weakness and generosity wasn't foolish. 2 years passed in a blur of hard work and slow growth. Rosa turned 7 and started reading to younger children, her voice clear and confident. Isabella's cooking became famous enough that people detoured miles to eat at the Last Lantern. Caleb added a workshop where he taught one-armed carpentry to a veteran who'd lost his arm at Gettysburg and thought his life was over. The ranch expanded to 20 cattle, then 30, then enough to be profitable beyond just feeding the inn's guests. On the anniversary of Mateo's death, they held a memorial. Isabella had been dreading it, worried that acknowledging his absence would break open wounds that had finally started to heal. But as people gathered in the common room, townspeople and former guests and travelers who'd heard about the man whose vision had inspired the Last Lantern, she realized this wasn't about grief anymore. It was about celebration. Rosa stood on a chair and read a letter she'd written to the father she barely remembered. Dear Papa, I am 7 years old now. Mama says I have your eyes and your courage. I live in an inn that helps people, just like you used to help people. Papa Caleb teaches me letters and numbers and how to fix things with one hand. Mama teaches me to cook and to be kind even when people are mean. They both say you would be proud of me. I hope that's true. I try to be brave like you were. I love you even though I don't remember you very much. Love, Rosa. There wasn't a dry eye in the room when she finished. Isabella held her daughter close while Caleb stood behind them with his hand on Isabella's shoulder, the three of them united in honoring a man who'd brought them together even in death. Tom Chen spoke next, sharing a story about Mateo helping his family find housing when no one else would. Lucia told about Miguel and Mateo working together to fight land grabs. Samuel Wright talked about the kind of courage it took to help people when powerful men wanted you silent. One by one, people who'd never met Mateo Cruz, but whose lives had been touched by the ripples of his goodness, stood and testified to his impact. When it was Caleb's turn, he pulled out the letter Mateo had written from jail, now carefully preserved behind glass. He read it aloud for everyone to hear, the plea to take care of Isabella and Rosa, the insistence that he didn't blame Caleb for anything, the hope that even if justice failed, kindness wouldn't. Mateo Cruz saved my life twice, Caleb said when he finished reading. Once on a battlefield in Arkansas, and once when he sent his family to my door and gave me a reason to stop drowning in guilt and start living again. I can't bring him back. I can't give Rosa her father or Isabella her first husband. But I can make damn sure his death meant something. I can make sure the world he believed in, where good people help each other and justice eventually wins, actually exists, at least in this corner of the prairie. That's his legacy. That's what we're all building here. And every person we help, every family we shelter, every child we teach, that's Mateo Cruz still fighting, still believing, still making the world better even though they hanged him for trying. The room erupted in agreement, people standing and clapping and wiping their eyes. Isabella felt something break open in her chest. Not grief this time, but release. She'd been carrying Mateo's death like a weight for 3 years, letting it define her, letting guilt about surviving and loving again poison the joy she'd found with Caleb and Rosa. But standing here, surrounded by proof that Mateo's vision had outlived him, that his death had inspired something bigger than one man's tragedy, she finally understood what Caleb had been trying to tell her all along. Survival wasn't betrayal. Building a new life wasn't forgetting. Loving again wasn't replacing. It was all just different ways of honoring someone who deserved so much better than the world had given him. The best way to remember Mateo wasn't to stop living in grief. It was to live so fully, so bravely, so generously that his values continued shaping the world long after his voice had been silenced. That night, after the guests had gone to bed and Rosa was asleep upstairs, Isabella and Caleb sat on the porch watching stars wheel overhead. The prairie stretched dark and vast around them, but the last lantern glowed behind them like a beacon, every lit window a promise that lost people could find their way home. "Do you ever regret it?" Isabella asked. "Taking us in, fighting Cain, building all this. You could have had a quiet life." "Quiet's overrated," Caleb said. "Besides, I had a quiet life before you came. It was killing me slower than a bullet, but just as surely. This," he gestured to the inn, the ranch, the life they'd built. "This is noisy and chaotic and exhausting, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. This is what it means to matter." Mateo would have liked you. If you'd met when you were both whole and healthy, if the war hadn't broken you both in different ways, I think you would have been friends even without the battlefield. I'd like to think so. Though knowing me, I probably would have been intimidated by how good he was at everything. Isabella laughed. He wasn't good at everything. He was terrible at cards, couldn't carry a tune to save his life, and he had this habit of losing things 5 seconds after he put them down. He was human, Caleb, flawed and imperfect and sometimes frustrating, but he tried. That's what made him good. Not that he was perfect, but that he kept trying even when it was hard. Like someone else I know. She leaned against him, fitting perfectly into the space beside his shoulder. We're quite a pair, aren't we? 2 broken people and a child, building an inn for other broken people. It probably shouldn't work, but it does. but it does. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars and listening to the sounds of the inn settling for the night. Floorboards creaking, a child coughing, someone laughing softly in one of the rooms. These were the sounds of life continuing, of people finding shelter and rest and hope. These were the sounds Mateo Cruz had died trying to protect. 5 years after Isabella had first knelt at Caleb's gate begging for food, the last lantern had become a fixture of the territory. Travelers planning routes west marked it on their maps as a necessary stop. Families in trouble knew they could come here and find help without judgment. Children from 20 miles around attended the school Caleb and the former teacher had established in the barn. The ranch supported 50 head of cattle and produced enough crops to feed the inn and sell surplus in town. Rosa was 10 years old, tall and confident, and so much like Mateo that sometimes Isabella had to turn away from the resemblance. She'd taken up sewing and was making a scarf decorated with desert marigolds, using the same pattern her father had used years ago. When Isabella asked who it was for, Rosa said simply, "For Papa Caleb. So he has something that connects him to my first papa. So everyone knows they're both my fathers." The scarf was presented on a Sunday afternoon when the whole family was sitting on the porch, watching storm clouds gather over the prairie. Rosa held it out to Caleb with ceremony, her face serious. "Thank you for being my papa," she said. "Thank you for teaching me and protecting me and loving Mama. Thank you for helping me remember my first papa, even though you're my papa now too. I made this so you'd know you're part of our family, part of our story. You're not just the man who kept a promise. You're the man who gave us a home and a future and proved that good things can grow from sad things if you work hard enough." Caleb took the scarf with shaking hands, tears streaming freely down his face. He wrapped it around his neck, the yellow flowers bright against his work shirt, and pulled Rosa into a fierce hug with his one arm. "You're the bravest person I know, Rosa Cruz Mercer. Your father, both your fathers, are so proud of you." Later that evening, after a storm had blown through, leaving the air clean and cool, Isabella found Caleb standing at the fence line wearing the scarf Rosa had made. He was staring at the inn, at the lit windows and the smoke curling from chimneys, at the physical proof that broken people could build something beautiful if they just refused to give up. "What are you thinking?" Isabella asked, sliding her arm around his waist. "That I used to think I lost everything when I lost this arm," he said, touching his right shoulder where the sleeve was pinned. "Thought I was useless, worthless, better off dead. But I was wrong. I didn't lose everything, I just hadn't found it yet. I lost a limb and found a whole family. Lost my old life and found a purpose worth living for. That's not a fair trade. It's a miracle. You gave us a miracle too, a place to belong, a father for Rosa, a love I thought I'd never feel again. We saved each other, Caleb. That's what families do." They stood together as the stars came out, two people who'd survived the worst the world could throw at them and built something worthy from the wreckage. Behind them, the last lantern glowed like its namesake, a beacon for the lost, a refuge for the weary, a testament to the truth that love could rise from the ashes of grief and justice, could win if enough people refused to look away. Inside, Rosa was reading to the younger children gathered around the fireplace, her voice clear and confident. She was reading about desert flowers that bloomed in the harshest places, about people who kept going when everything said they should quit, about hope being stronger than despair if you fed it right. The children listened with rapt attention, seeing themselves in the stories, learning that they too could survive hard things and build beautiful things and become people who mattered. On the frontier ruled by bullets and crooked laws, their true victory wasn't the hanging of a tyrant or the building of an inn. It was this: a warm table set for anyone who needed it, a fearless child carrying forward her father's legacy, a love strong enough to honor the past while building toward the future. It was proof that one good man's death could inspire a whole community to be better, that grief could transform into grace, that broken people could mend each other through the simple act of refusing to give up. Isabella looked at Caleb, at this man who'd opened his door to strangers and changed the course of 3 lives, and felt her heart swell with gratitude and love and fierce determination. They'd come so far from that frozen morning when she'd knelt in his dirt begging for a plate of food. She'd asked for one meal, for survival, for just enough to keep going one more day. He'd given her a life, a family, a home, a future worth fighting for. And together, with Rosa between them and Mateo's memory blessing them from wherever good men went when they died, they'd built something that would outlast them all, a place where broken things could be mended, where hungry people could be fed, where the lost could find their way home. Not because it was easy, and not because the world made it simple, but because love was stronger than hate, and hope was tougher than despair, and sometimes, if you were brave enough to keep trying, justice actually won. The last lantern burned bright against the prairie darkness, and 3 people who'd survived impossible things stood together beneath its glow and knew, finally, that they were home.